We ready?
Yep,
All right.
thanks.
So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be presenting total financial services department, if you will. I know in years past we've had Colleen and David come present tax and assessment. There are so few changes this year that I think I'm just going to go ahead and present all three, give them the Saturday off. Just to start, so the total, if you combine the finance department, tax and assessor, as well as the audit line and the Board of Finance budget, the total proposed budget is $787,279, which is a 6.4% decrease over last year's appropriation. For finance, that's $322,000 budget, which is a 13.2% decrease. Tax collection, a 1.8% decrease. Assessor, a 0.6% decrease. And then audit and Board of Finance slightly up at 0.6%. This is a total of 8 budgeted FTEs between all of the departments. That's down 0.5, as I'll get into, I think, on the next slide, from the current year, fiscal 18. The services and programs we offer are general financial administration, treasury, payroll, accounts payable, investments, trust management, procurement, and accounting, and then in addition, tax assessment and collection. Areas of focus for the upcoming year, obviously the transition to a new finance director and treasurer is going to be a key feature of the next year. Always our goal to maintain our AAA bond rating and adequate reserve levels, and working in conjunction with the Board of Finance. Perform a fraud audit and continue staff cybersecurity training, as we touched on earlier. Maintain tax collection rate above 99, ideally even above 99.5%. And explore the possibility of a tax sale in the next year, and continue to value property fairly and in a timely manner. Budget highlights, as I said before, the $41,000 decrease in the finance department's budget is a net reduction due to shifting the deputy town manager, former deputy director of administrative services, which was split for the last 7 years really between the finance department and the central administration. So now under the new organization, that you'll see in your budgets is fully reflected in the front office budget. And sorry, the rest is just contractual increases. $5,200 reduction, another highlight in the contractual services account. This is again due to a $15,700 coding shift to the town manager's budget for the Yukon graduate IPP program. I don't recognize Mohammed is here today. And so that will now be shifted over into the town manager's office. That was previously in the finance department's budget. But we do have a $10,000 new line item, $10,500 for the annual maintenance fee for the capital asset reporting and tagging system that we implemented in the last, well, really in the current fiscal year as part of the fiscal 17 audit. Finally, just another small increase, $1,000 increase total in the contractual services. It's largely due to the CAMA data service that David uses, just the fee increase. And then again, the largest reduction across finance, tax, and assessor is $8,900, which is really just a shift over into the consolidated postage account, as you've seen in other budgets today. So trends and challenges for next year. Again, I think this can't be overstated either. Managing and responding to the state's ongoing fiscal challenges and estimating the impact on the town. It's something I've spent, certainly in the last year, more time doing than I probably anticipated and that we probably have time for. But certainly last year as we got through the governor's budget, which took really the better part of the year. And hopefully this year is a little better. But again, that's with limited staff. There's just 3 folks in the finance department. I'm the only one that does really budget and the analysis of the state budget analytics or any sort of things along that line. It's really kind of a one-person operation. Improving our cybersecurity controls and employee training, as we touched on earlier, to minimize the risk of fraud or hacking. Again, staffing challenges. We've talked about this in the past few years. The finance department itself used to have 4 employees up until 3 or 4 years ago. There's various functions, and really if we could eventually get a combined function in there. There's no administrative support. It's the only department without an administrative assistant. There's no procurement specialist. It's something I know Maria's a big supporter of, is down the line. And again, this is going to be, a lot of this is going to be influenced by whoever replaces me. But in a perfect world, we would have, I would recommend a procurement officer or person who could help departments with purchasing. Right now, that is spread out over the various departments, validated by finance. But again, I think there's a more efficient way we could do that.
Would that bring consistency to the process too?
I think it would, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of things we need to do. We need to work on updating, even our purchasing policy, frankly, needs to be updated. I know it's something this board's discussed before, for consistency across departments, and also purchasing power. I mean, there's certain things, even just from the Office Depot orders and things that are all kind of done scattershot across different departments. And if one person or one system could manage those all together, I think that would help. But again, it's just sort of been issues of which, and in the last couple of years, again, with increased demands from both the Board of Finance and I think responsiveness in the budget, having a budget analyst is also something I could really see being a huge help, because we're looking for timely information. You're looking for information and reports on how we're doing, how our fund balance is tracking. And right now, again, it's just sort of, we're spread pretty thin. So
Sean, can I just explore that a little bit more? So of all the statements we had, this is the one area that had the most, what I'll call banging, clanging, and smoke relative to staffing stress. So I assume there was discussion around whether a staff person here gets included, excluded. Just talk a little bit of, I know the budget's tight, but just talk a little bit about where we were relative to wanting to include, not include, thoughts around this, so.
Sure. I mean, again, I think the timing is tricky with I'd want the new person to really be able to influence the way they want to shape that department. The budget shift alone of Melissa's salary, it's not like, we all know Melissa's job description still includes support for finance. It's not like, and she's been an enormous help during the budget, so it's not like the numbers reflect a lack of support there. But I do think, we are, I think we could do better, certainly with some of the, whether it's the budget analytics or some of that just kind of redundant functions. I think also the other concern I have is within the next couple of years, I think our assistant finance director, who's really our accounting manager, is also going to be retirement eligible. That's a concern I have as well, in terms of having somebody with some accounting experience. And again, I think it's going to influence who's chosen for the finance director position also. That's why I've been strongly advocating a strong accounting background, because we need to have somebody ready to manage through a transition time or to pick up the pieces as we go through that. So I just think that's something that's really important.
Mm-hmm. This was something that we had quite a bit of conversation around, and it is an area that was at the top of the list for things that, were closer to, say, maybe being recommended as a service improvement. Going back to Sean's slide on the fraud risk assessment, I do suspect we back in Mansfield also had Bloom Shapiro, and recently had gone through a fraud risk assessment as well. And just, looking at some things, a project on my potential to-do list that I'll be bringing forward to you is working on the purchasing ordinance. So our purchasing ordinance is incredibly dated. We don't have strong purchasing policies or procedures. We really should be working on a financial, just in general, financial policies and procedures manual. So again, purchasing, I think, is a potential area of risk for us. It's very decentralized now, and we don't really have strong procedures and policies around that. And again, could perhaps, something Sean and I had talked about is, if we did have an additional staff person, could that person be more of a generalist so that they could do some purchasing work for us, but also do some budgeting work, do some program evaluation work, help pick up the slack with other financial functions. But until we get a new director and really seeing what that person feels is a vision for the department, as well as potential holes or areas of concern that they have, how we might structure that person. I think if we went out and just looked for, a budget analyst or just a purchasing agent, based on our size and volume and our needs, that we may, again, be better served by looking for somebody who's more of a generalist. But again, those were some of the types of conversations that we had around this position. And again, I think some things that our fraud risk assessment will pick up, and again, our audit picked up as well, is because the department is so small. For example, is the person who does our payroll and is cutting our checks also has the ability to create vendors in this system. So there are some challenges because there are just so few people in that department. So this is a particular area, I think, of definitely future focus for us. And with the new director, when they come on board, would like to flesh that idea out a little bit more with them.
Ron?
So with respect to the purchasing ordinance, Chris, didn't you and I look at this a year or so ago? Didn't that come through a subcommittee of ours?
I don't, if it did, I don't
I think the
remember
first
specifically.
selectwoman shot it down at the time, and candidly, it was, I thought, overly restrictive towards department heads, right? Because either you or the first select woman, now the town manager, had to pretty much sign off on everything, guardrails, nails.
Well, you're right, we did review, there is a current there is a
Right.
current process we use, absolutely.
It
yeah.
was overly constraining, especially within, I think, the public works and highway department space, because I think where a lot of the noise is coming from, right?
I think that's right. I mean, I think there was a little bit of different philosophy between the first selectman and the department heads on terms of how much of that is appropriate, and I think
Right.
that still needs to be fleshed out, but I think now a good chance to revisit that for sure.
Okay, yeah, because my point is I think I thought we had a good working draft at the time of improvements based on a lot of department head recommendation for what would, I think, alleviate, but you were also involved, right, from a.
That was before, right, so that was when Joe was here as
Joe
the
was
finance
in,
director,
right.
so, but, yes, as I understand, there are still draft,
Yeah.
comments on that, again, now maybe with, a
Yeah.
new, fresh look at it, we could push that forward.
Because obviously, we still wanted our chief fiscal officer involved in that process and from an appropriate standpoint, but,
Yeah.
you know, again, we were replacing guardrails and having to go through several layers of approval, and, I mean, a guardrail is a guardrail, that's, you know, and when somebody hits one, it's a pretty standardized process, so there was some significant improvements to there. And the only reason I bring that up is because if we can improve process, I'm all for increasing FTE. But, you know, again, with all of the needs with police department, with I mean, again, I agree that the finance department has the need, but, you know, as we step back and look at the budget in totality, the conversation we just had about mental health and opioid funding, you know, I think we need to just make sure that if that's the road we go down, we're understanding what we're potentially giving up in other spaces.
So just other trends and challenges, again, you know, something we're monitoring certainly from the tax collection office is, you know, the impact of the new cap on local tax deductions. We experienced it during the current year. It's just really a shift in the timing of some of our revenues, but it'll be interesting to monitor and see if that has any impact in future years. And then again, just even some of the creative responses that we've seen, I'm sure you've heard, but in the governor's proposed budget, there's a proposal that I assume is not going to go anywhere, but this is just indicative of some of the challenges that we are having to monitor and try to assess what the impact would be. Would be a proposal where your taxes would no longer essentially be taxes, they'd be classified as donations to charity, and then you'd get a credit against that. So ultimately, I mean, again, it's sort of laughable. It's in the governor's actual proposed budget, but it's a creative, I suppose, way of trying to get around this cap where there is no cap on charitable deductions under the new tax law. Obviously, the IRS is not, they're going to have a sort of a substance over form doctrine there that I think will come into play. But nonetheless, I think it's just these sort of, from the state, we're often put in this position where we have to look at some of these proposals and analyze them, and that kind of takes some time in sort of assessing which ones to take seriously and which ones you don't have to. But obviously, we'll be monitoring that one as well as we go forward.
Do we take any of them seriously? Don't answer that.
I'm not gonna say. And then the only CNR project that we have on here is 1/4 funding for the next revaluation. We did not have this included in the last year's budget, so this would be, instead of 1/5, obviously we do this every 5 years. At the moment would be, if approved, this would be 1/4 of our estimated funding. Obviously, this is a difficult one to predict. As we've seen even last time, the bids can come in a pretty wide range, and it's also dependent on how exhaustive the reval is proposed to be. And again, you're kind of projecting 3 years out where these bids may be and what other towns are doing reval at the same time. So the recommendation is for a 1/4 funding as we used to do.
And that's the big reval, right? That's the full walk around.
That's the full one,
canvas.
right. So it could be north of 250,000. I think the note
Right.
here at the bottom, the last time we did that 10 years ago, every other one, as Sean is saying, is really the more full with some measuring and actual inspections. The median bid was 333. That doesn't mean that's where it'll be, but
Yeah.
if we'd be at least in striking distance, if we were up to 250 after 4 years, rather than waiting as we have sometimes till the last 2 years and done 2
If I
appropriations.
recall, there was a substantial difference in deliverable as well in terms of what we were getting, support, meetings, and
That's right.
each company was going to do the revaluation, but then the additional
Right.
services that came with us to help us through the process.
All the way
Again,
through
with the
appeal.
limited staff,
That's right.
that was a critical piece of it as well.
Sure.
Okay.
And that's all I have.
Thanks, Sean.
Questions?
Yeah, any other questions?
So I think we should note that this is probably one of your last public appearances with us before you move on to different pastures, certainly not greener, but Sean, you've served in a
Similar.
lot of different capacities. In a large time, you've been involved in this town as long as I've been on this board. And I've certainly appreciated all the different roles that you played and the professionalism and ideas and spirit that you brought to this. I think you've helped us out in a number of interim spots, both as interim finance director and as interim town manager. While Maria's the first official town manager, you were the first interim town manager.
Yeah.
I'm the asterisk.
There were a couple asterisks. We won't talk about that.
But my point being, I think that was a nice capstone to your career here in town. You grew in a lot of different ways and helped us grow, so we really appreciate what you've done. And again, where we ended up today, I think, has a lot to do with not only other folks, but with your contributions as well. So I appreciate
Appreciate that
everything
very
you
much.
brought.
And the support of this board throughout my seven and a half years, believe it or not, has been tremendous. And I've always really appreciated everything you guys have done for me here too.
We wish you the best in
Yeah.
Cheshire, and
Wish you the best.
Yeah, Cheshire's very lucky.
Are you gonna get new vests in your new position? or-
First thing, emergency management.
Think of a Simsbury
I
one.
know.
Wear them at least
Aren't
once a
you
week.
still gonna
Say
wear the
Sean
old
or
ones
Kimball?
though, aren't you?
says, Sean, can I have your old one?
Yeah.
Damn, I gotta change my
It also
name.
says Deputy Director of Administration, position that no longer exists.
Don't tempt him.
They'll just tape over it.
All seriousness, though, thank you, Sean.
Right, yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much.
I think the next set of items are Maria's.
Now we're gonna have some fun.
Yeah.
Is it really 2:30? I feel like we've only been here for an hour. This is just
Really? That's good, because we're here till 8 tonight.
What's this wee stuff?
Yeah. Gotta bring my 2-year-old in here in a couple minutes. We'll see about that.
Oh,
Then I'll bring in my 19-year-old.
Okay, so we're
I bet he
starting
can
to.
whine just as big.
Sorry. So we're starting to wind down with our operating budgets. So we combined town manager's office, the general government, and the board of selectmen budgets into this next set of slides for us. And so the proposed budget is a 0.7% increase. As you'll see, there are a lot of changes throughout this budget. With the new form of government, we did our best to create a town manager's office departmental budget and reallocated a lot of expenses that were allocated in various parts of the organization. So we'll be walking through some of those in a moment. But our key services and programs are implementation of policies and initiatives, as well as development and administration of our human resources program. And I'm sorry, I just realized that's the wrong set of slides. Sorry. This is our old version, if you give us a minute.
Oh, yeah,
It was
no
just running,
problem.
it was just running too smoothly today. We uploaded.
Wait, which one had a lower number, Maria?
Yeah,
Go with that one.
I move that we
Steve Jobs.
approve
That's the other one. Yeah.
John, you're leaving. Tell us which
Sorry
one we
about
should
that.
go with.
Sorry, so-
Which one's better? Give me a thumbs up.
So while we break for station identification,
You've been dying to say that, haven't you?
oh, I have, you better believe it.
Actually, I do have a question about your participation in some of this, since we're going to discuss the stipend.
Yeah, and I
don't we-
welcome that conversation.
Is
but-
that
I would
I
just
should-
suggest, why don't we just talk about everything else but that, and
Yeah.
then if we need, and just leave that as a separate item. For today? If, because, Eric needs to participate in the general government
yes,
discussion.
he does.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think we have to block that part out.
I mean, if there's a time when you know, it's appropriate to talk about it, I'll step out of the room.
Yeah, because from a, BOS has the stipend, but it also has public agency support in it, and I think obviously Eric should and must contribute to the public agency support section of it, so.
Yeah.
Similar to how we talk about other line items when each of us have a conflict, if we just exclude that individual account from the discussion, and then if we need to have a
Right,
discussion.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to bring it up for the benefit
Yeah.
of the group.
Not that I'm trying to decide for you, but just
No.
make
Yeah.
We
it,
might not be discussing the stipend because it's the same as.
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
but, yeah.
It's
yeah,
consistent.
that's a good way of doing it.
Well, and in fact, this board had agreed on that number ahead of time, so there shouldn't be that much discussion around it now.
Would
but-
you mind if we skipped ahead to engineering while Melissa and I try to
let's do
find out
that.
what happened to the correct version? We're having a technology glitch. We're not sure what happened. But I don't want to, I'd like to keep things moving,
Yeah,
so if you're
let's
comfortable
do
with
that.
it,
Let's page
I'll let
Pisano.
Jeff go ahead and do his
Get back in.
presentation while we see if we
Pisano
can
back in here.
talk to Buzz and find out what happened to
Yeah,
the correct version.
that 24/7 on-call guy.
We actually got
that,
hacked.
Who opened the email? Come on.
Maria, we tend to be very good until our leadership leaves the room.
Somebody
All of a
else-
sudden, that's where we get out of control.
Hey, Chris, they gave me a
Hey,
sharp
open
pencil.
the
We're in
email.
trouble.
You have left the kids unattended up here.
I move. First of all, we lock the doors. And not let Maria back in for 20 minutes.
That's fine, Maria.
Don't worry.
Now, that pet project that you had,
I got some stuff.
No. Okay.
Reel us
said what I
back.
would-
Sean's out of room, oh, yeah.
Oh, Sean's out of the room.
Go.
Let's go, okay.
Somebody got the water ordinance? Go get it.
It's getting late.
You're brilliant, brilliant, Cheryl.
The Askham
Here we go.
ordinance is about to come
It's
passed.
water and irrigation all together.
Sorry, Jeff.
Our
All right.
apologies, Jeff.
The floor is yours.
We'll try to behave.
So good afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity here to present my budget. It's going to be short. I knew I was late in the program, and at this point in the day, I understand now after 3 years, there's a little fatigue at this point, so.
You can have whatever you want, Jeff.
So our budget is one of the smaller budgets at $265,288. There was a 1.4% increase, primarily due to contractual obligations. Our services and programs, our primary one is capital project development and management. We support both our own projects and other departments' projects at different levels of support. But that's a huge part of our effort during our work week. We also review proposed development activity, and as you know, that's increased over the last few years. And it's difficult to manage in terms of timing, when those applications come in and when we have to put a fairly intense effort into them to review them appropriately. We also do GIS services and support for all the departments and manage that process through updating data, working with our vendor, and hopefully providing additional information to the public as it becomes available, and it makes sense to provide that information. We also manage grants, primarily infrastructure grants, that come through our department and through other departments. Presently have about 5 or 6 active grants that we're managing. Other small things we do, or less important things, or less time-consuming things, we issue excavation permits for work in the right-of-way. In 2017, we issued about 164 permits, and that could range from a driveway reconstruction to a utility upgrade or expansion, such as a gas line expansion or a water main replacement project that occurred up in the north part of town last year. We also support the Public Building Committee, the Open Space Committee. We process agricultural leases and monitor the activities on those parcels. And we kind of manage a lot of the environmental regulatory compliance for our facilities. Stormwater management, industrial permits, landfill monitoring and testing, those types of things, to try to keep those things current. And just going back to the grants, there are quarterly reports that we have to do on those grants, so there's a lot of administrative work after the grant is actually executed that we take care of. Our areas of focus for fiscal year 19 is, project management for our capital projects. With the new projects that are proposed, we'll have 23 active projects with a value of about $11 million. They're all in various stages of study, design, construction, or just conception. And we also manage all the consultants that provide professional services for those projects, be it architects, engineers, hazardous material testing labs, that type of thing. Some of the bigger projects we're working on right now is the Town Facilities Master Plan. We're currently refining our RFP, hope to release it within the next few weeks, and have some information available for the next budget cycle to be able to use that for capital planning. We're also doing bridge and dam studies, looking at Stoddard Dam right now over on West Mountain Road to see what needs to be done to bring that up to current design standards, hydraulic and hydrological standards, and hopefully programming that in an out year, which we have done in the capital program, in terms of improvements that may be required there. We're also looking at our bridges. We've applied for a couple of grants through the local bridge program, and we're hoping we get some money if the state comes through with their lots of funding. On that, we're looking at the Old Flower Bridge in terms of doing, we did a major inspection of that bridge. We're doing a load analysis right now. And the next stage is to do a rehabilitation study to determine what it's going to cost to keep that bridge in good serviceable condition. So that'll be occurring in the next year. As Tom Roy had mentioned, we're implementing the stormwater management plan that we developed with the new permit. There's additional requirements. So we're trying to keep current with that, so we're in compliance with DEP. And we're also hopefully going to get to our rewrite of the town construction and design standards. This was funded in a prior year, but with all the development and projects, we just haven't been able to get to it. And we're hopefully going to align that with the rewrite of the zoning regulations that planning and development is also going to undertake this year, we believe. As I said, no significant changes to the budget. It's essentially a flat budget. Also wanted to mention, as part of our budget expenditures, the Board of Education, just as a reminder, contributes $20,000 to our expenditures for salaries for support of projects that they may need during the year. So we work closely with Burke and provide different levels of service to different projects, frankly. And that's worked out really well. We also provide some funding for our staff from capital projects where we need support services from other employees. As you know, we have Rich Sawitsky, who's a part-time employee right now. He works 17 hours a week, and we've been paying some of those expenditures out of capital projects where it makes sense. In terms of trends for fiscal year 19, again, reviewing and monitoring the development projects is one of the more important activities we see to contribute to economic development, to make that process move as quickly as we can. And some of the big projects that I see on the horizon, again, are Tobacco Valley Solar. As you know, we worked hard on that all year last year, and we can expect that we're going to have to continue to monitor and be involved with that project, just so it's well received by the public and that problems don't develop during the construction activities. The Ridge at Talcott Mountain, which is underway, as you know, we're monitoring that to make sure they're in compliance with their zoning approvals. Cambridge Crossing, which is under construction, again, another sort of major project, kind of at an important phase in that project right now with utility work and earthwork occurring. And I think Jamie mentioned 690 Hot Meadow, which is the Ensign House. We anticipate that'll be coming in and probably be being underway during the fiscal year. So our other activities, again, just maintaining plan schedules for funded capital projects. And in a couple of instances, we have fallen behind on a couple of those. A couple of them have gotten more complicated than I think we originally envisioned. So those have had some delays in them, and we're trying to get back on schedule with those. One Old Bridge being a good example, Riverside Road and Drake Hill Road Bridge being the other example. And Jerry had mentioned earlier the lighting project up at the farms. We haven't initiated that yet. But in some respects, there may be some opportunities, again, to to work with the communication issues up there in terms of getting fiber up there and kind of saving a little money by combining those projects together. And again, pursuing grant opportunities. We've been already working with Maria to try to find good grant opportunities that make sense for us to apply for. We don't want to spend a lot of time and effort when we're just kind of throwing stuff at the wall that doesn't make a lot of sense, and we don't have a high probability of getting the funds. So we're trying to be smarter about grants that we apply for. And the one capital project that I guess I was just going to talk about a little bit was the multi-use trail project, the project between Simsbury and Bloomfield that we received the $1 million grant. That project is moving forward. We finally got all our agreements executed, including our professional service agreements. So the design on that is actually underway right now. And again, we're hoping with the state budget problems, we're hoping that gets resolved and there's no rescissions of any grant commitments on the construction side that, would pay for this project. And that is my short presentation.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, any questions?
That's the one that's in jeopardy, right?
Potentially.
It's in jeopardy, but there's another program that it might convert to. My experience working with CROG is, once it's in the queue, it's got a pretty good chance, high probability of getting funded. It might take a couple more years, but ultimately, it will get funded.
Okay, so we've got the funds set aside for that on our side.
We already
We do.
previously approved those funding. That's
Right.
really, this is kind of the advice of the bond council, to make sure we have full appropriation to authorize the spending, even though a large chunk of that's coming out of the refund.
Yep.
So that's a purely grant-funded portion of the previously.
So at this point, the risk is, one, we would lose it, but it sounds like that's a little bit lower, but two, that the project cost would escalate as time goes on?
That's possible.
Okay. But that's, we're not talking about substantial escalation in a year or two, right?
Probably not. It's relatively straightforward in terms of the project itself. Rock removal is the biggest unknown right now.
Dino Nobel can help us out with that, right?
Yeah.
Possibly.
They probably
Other questions?
We now have that agreement for the halftime share with Bloomfield Engineering, right?
We do.
How is that working?
Building.
That's building.
That's
You're
building.
Oh,
talking
that's
about
building. I'm
inspector?
sorry. I was thinking that,
No, we
Can't
did
speak to
we
that,
did the
no.
allotment with the Board of Ed a couple of years ago, the partial
Right.
sharing.
no, my fault. I was thinking that was in engineering. That's in building.
We have a sharing agreement with this project in terms of how we pay it and how we get reimbursed. That was the agreement I was referring to.
Yep.
Right, I was thinking it was something else.
In answer to your question, though, on the building inspector, though, he was just hired, I think it was
3 weeks.
3 weeks ago or so.
Oh,
So he's
okay.
on board, so it's kind of very recent.
So we're
history,
just
but-
getting used to that?
Yep.
Okay. I knew it had happened. I
Yeah.
just trying to think of when it was.
No, keep on managing those
Yeah.
projects, Jeff.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jeff.
Sure.
Thank you.
And the verdict?
IT is trying to recover our files, something did happen. So
We need to
while
sign
we're
something,
doing
or-
that, should we just jump into yesterday?
Yeah, I was wondering
Yeah.
if, we
Maria?
could go,
I mean, Joanne sent us this whole document in an email at the end of the week. Is it possible within that? There was a,
You want to try to figure that out while you spruce the capital?
Let's get Burke out
Well,
of
we
here.
could let Burke do the,
Okay.
Let's do that.
Yeah, why don't we do capital and Burke can get out of here?
I don't think, did Joanne send you the PowerPoint slides on Friday afternoon?
I don't,
no, not PowerPoint.
no.
Oh,
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
no, no.
It was, yeah, Melissa and I were
Okay.
here
Yeah,
the
no,
last time
okay.
we did finishing touches, so, thank you. Thanks for being patient. We'll see if IT can recover.
Oh, that's
the
very
file.
strange.
All
That's
right.
very strange.
yeah. Yeah, let's go to Burke's presentation.
Burke.
One in the order of the list of capital, or I didn't see.
I think we
I'll do the Board of
had.
You're the only one who bonded.
Yeah.
Before, yeah.
Thanks, Maria. All right, good afternoon. So looking at Board of Ed projects, this presentation, which you have a copy of, is really highlighting the 18-19 first year of our plan. And just a quick overview of the 5 projects that I'm going to speak to. beginning with the facilities master plan and reconfiguration study, similar to what was approved for the town facilities master plan last year. We're looking to do something very similar to that for our 7 schools, looking at the inventory of, what is the priority and need for future maintenance, and of course, cost estimating to help us with capital planning, just like Jeff spoke to. In addition, we also are asking for support in looking at potential grade reconfigurations, looking at our modular buildings, which we know at the high school, we're going to have the peak has already been reached, and now we're going to start seeing that bubble has been moving through. So you may be familiar with the fact that we did a 6th grade feasibility study that showed that could be moved to Henry James, and that's something that, we would share that sort of data and ask for support in looking at how to look at more of a public process to consider that. The next project is district network infrastructure, and we have typically done this on an every other year basis. Highlighted here some of the projects within this budget. We have an upgrade to 10 gigabytes for our local area network. We've done the high school and Henry James previously, so this would get our other 5 schools to that same level. The other area is voicemail replacements, and that's really looking at a total phone system replacement for several schools. And then the other largest part of that funding is for our storage area network, our SAN, that needs to be replaced also. And then we have some other smaller wireless and server. And now for our largest project, obviously Henry James Middle School Phase 3 renovation. This is the same design that we had ready last year that was tabled. So some of you have seen this before and some of you have not. I've really just pulled out 2 slides here. This is just a quick listing of the major focal points: having a new library media center, new science classrooms, or CLABs, which allow both standard classroom and lab within the same footprint, and focusing on STEM. An auditorium also would be added. The renovation of the entire tech ed and family consumer science wing, which is quite dated, and really doing some very basic classroom renovations to areas that have never been touched, just some flooring and lighting and painting. And then a pretty important aspect of this that I think hasn't been talked about as frequently is just getting sort of that second half of our fire suppression system to be fully sprinklered. So that cost estimate now of $23,965,620 is updated. The architectural firm Castle Booz that we've been working with, they hired a professional cost estimating group. We had used them last year. They updated it for inflation, and we ended up with a little over $1 million increase just because of the timing, just because of construction costs and the increase in those. So I've really just included the macro overview of what parts of the building would be touched. So you see with sort of gray areas or areas that would not be touched. The areas that are outlined in red are all of the areas that would have fire protection added. The additions, the blue area, oops, there we go, in that area that would be our new library media center, which would then connect to the tech ed family consumer science area here. That portion, and then the auditorium portion here would be the new square footage, and then ultimately where we do heavy levels of renovation would be in the dark green, so as I mentioned, the tech ed areas. And then the science classrooms, which are essentially stacked here, those areas would be changed structurally also. So ultimately, this project would be eligible for state reimbursement, and we updated the cost estimate for that reimbursement to a little over $5.7 million. That was after the architects and myself went back to the state agency and met last month, looked at our current project and data, and wanted to just to make sure that we had a good estimate there. So that's a quick overview. If there are questions about the project, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Sean, did you have a question?
I do. So Burke, in reverse order, to your last point there on likelihood of state reimbursement, just walk us through how that works. We approve this at referendum.
Right. So
Obviously, you don't, not obviously, but correct me if I'm wrong, you don't submit for reimbursement until the completion of the project, right?
basically, you can submit during, but yes, our process is to always have an appropriation for the entire amount.
Yep.
And then ultimately, we apply for the grant application. We actually do that by June 30th. So this would be the schedule. Basically, you would have, if there's a referendum in May, a grant application has to be submitted by June 30th. There's some action by Board of Selectmen that needs to take place to refer a project to a public building committee. The grant application is submitted. The Board of Ed obviously has to approve the educational specs for this project. Then you would go out to bid, and really you would be talking about an 18-month assumed construction schedule. But in order to do, to confirm your architect final plans and specs, you'd have to get out to bid in early part of 2019 to be able to hit that construction when school is out in June of 2019. So that's why you'd be looking at then a full school year where you would be ultimately trying to be ready for that fall of the following school year. So it sounds like a long time frame, but it really does require a lot of things that would have to fall into place very, very quickly.
Okay, and I appreciate that. So I guess what I'm leading to is, so we file, presuming this is approved, et cetera, we file the grant application, it's approved at the state, and then we're good? Or do we have to hold our breath for 2 years and hope the state doesn't continue to have fiscal challenges and we may get reimbursed?
We have never had a situation where, I mean, the state creates a list, and we essentially are not sure about that list. We have to sort of take that leap of faith, but ultimately we have not heard anything that would indicate that the state has changed, that they're going to fund projects. It's just a question of they have a new amount that they reimburse, some new procedures, but ultimately, if you make the list, we have always been funded. There has never been a project that made the list and then wasn't ultimately funded by the state.
All right, I appreciate that perspective. The reason I bring it up is because, we talked a lot last year about teacher pension. We talked a lot about, ECS funding, and that was one of the quieter topics that I don't think the general public truly understood. That can impact communities like ours significantly if the state continues to change the formula on reimbursement from school projects, because each community is treated differently, right?
Well, there's one standard process, and I think most of the changes have been more about what amount per square foot they're willing to pay. The state's formulas are updated on an annual basis about what percentage that we're eligible for. So that really just varies more based on the existing formula.
I guess where I'm going, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Simsbury and a city or Simsbury and another town don't get the same reimbursement.
Correct.
Because
We're in
different
the
communities.
mid-30s, and there's
Right.
high needs districts that the majority of their project is fully state.
Right. Okay. And then so going backwards, Board of Ed has obviously endorsed this. Has there been discussion? Is there cost breakout from fire suppression, renovation, and then with and without new construction?
So I'm going to pass out the same cost estimate that was just revised. This was
like you knew I was
same,
gonna ask.
same as last year. There is not a sort of mix and match
Yeah.
that just breaks it out, but I'll attempt to answer your question as that's coming around. It shows major media center square footage cost at about 2.25 million. Shows the auditorium at about 3.8 million. Then there's a lot of other building renovations that are lumped together for about 7.4 million.
Okay.
So your fire suppression is not broken out, it would be within that.
Yep.
And then you have some hazardous materials design contingency, but essentially the total of that construction hard cost, so-called, was about 19 million. So you see the line that says adjusted escalation to July 2019. So that's the 1.1 million that I mentioned right at the outset. So they didn't attempt to change what had been the same cost breakdown before. Then we have some other furnishings, technology, and then all the soft costs are down below. So ultimately, if you were to really look at what if you didn't build something, I think the most common question I've heard is what is the auditorium cost? Your soft costs added onto that would be closer to like $4.7 million roughly. But it's not broken out in such an
Tough to do.
exacting way. It's in that range. But you can see what the cost per square foot is. The auditorium cost does include the furnishings of the the high-tech equipment is in that number, and the seats and things of that nature.
Okay, I appreciate that. And so Sean, we've got the bond capacity slide, right, the debt capacity slide. Does that contemplate 18 or 23?
Yeah, so what it contemplates 18 to 24, whatever
Okay.
the number is. Right now in the model, it is all including, I mean, theoretically, depending on how rapidly this construction happens, it could be bonded over 2 tranches. It could. Right now, though, of course, the model also contemplates 15-year borrowing. Board of Finance talked a lot about that. So right now, the first budget year impact of that full 18 is it's modeled as if we're borrowing the entire 18 million for 15 years and hitting fiscal 2021 as the first budget impact year.
So we'd be going out to bond in 20?
Theoretically, right. So it's going to depend on how rapidly they spend those dollars. That might be slightly on the conservative side. Again, if we don't have to borrow all 18 million that first year, it could wait another year or even 2 to borrow it, but we're just going to all depend on the cash flow. So right now, I'm trying to be a little more conservative and have it all borrowed at once, kind of how we used to model it. But
Also,
those-
from an interest rate climate standpoint, we'd have to do an evaluation of, does it make sense? Do we want to take on the exposure of waiting for an additional tranche and if the rate goes up?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So I'll stick to what I said last year, Burke, which is, I don't feel it's my job on the Board of Selectmen, and others can disagree, to micromanage Board of Ed projects. I mean, you guys, I think, have looked at this for 10 years, so I'm gonna support this. But I think you're gonna run into challenges at the Board of Finance on renovation versus new. So I'm not asking for any changes, but I would envision that might be where your challenges are in terms of, I think everybody agrees, and I'm trying not to speak for everybody, but I think in conversations around that building definitely needs to be renovated, we definitely need to deal with fire suppression, et cetera. I think the challenge arises for us in terms of what folks may or may not be deeming additions nice to have new. And I don't view the media center or the addition as nice to have, for the education that we provide and what I think this community expects, they make sense, right? But I foresee that as a challenge as we move through this process, and candidly, I think with the residents as well, in terms of so the more we can talk about it, and again, I know it's dangerous to break down costs, but I think being transparent does help with the process, so I appreciate it.
And we'll be presenting the budget to the Board of Finance Tuesday night, and we will be looking at both operating and giving them kind of a similar view of capital, just so that they understand what's involved.
Okay. No, but I appreciate it. I know you've worked really hard on this, so
Yeah.
thank you.
If I could pick up on that, I think that dynamic is totally appropriate to point out. My own personal philosophy, since at this point, we're accountable for the capital project, when I approve it and move it forward, I'm basically endorsing, and not just kind of passing it through. So for me personally, it's a recommendation to the Board of Finance with my approval.
Right, so.
Thank you. Mike?
I had two questions, or question and a comment. I am assuming in both the media center and the auditorium, at least I can't see it, that there's a red line around that, but you're sprinkling those areas
Yes,
too?
yes.
Okay. Just wanted to.
Good point.
Check my assumption. The other thing is, I am concerned about the auditorium more from a dollar aspect, not the use of it or anything else. That's almost 20% of the budget, or close to it. That's my only concern with it. The rest, I mean, I'll be honest, I think the technology center is just fine. It was great when I was there, but no, I'm kidding.
That was a newspaper lab.
We still had stone as easels, so.
Did they have those Xerox machines that you used?
Yeah, matter of fact, they did. But no, I absolutely see the reason for it, and it is, you got to keep moving forward. But I am concerned, and to Chris's point, when we pass it on, I believe we are endorsing the project, and that's my only concern with it. But I also see why, anytime you go back to redo a project, I mean, it just costs us $1 million more by waiting. It was the right decision last year, whether I liked it or not,
Too much
wasn't the
uncertainty,
issue.
yeah. John, why? And I know some people have asked, previously, but the state does reimburse for an auditorium in this project. They would not reimburse for a standalone project that's just an auditorium. So sometimes people have said, well, why don't you wait and do that later? Well, that's one of the considerations.
Reimbursement. Fair enough.
Okay, thank you for that.
So two more summaries. So we talked earlier about school security. So for all of our schools, $850,000 is being requested. Broken out, really a quick summary of some of the known areas. We definitely have a new generation of exterior locks with the fobs that allow access in all of our schools. So we have to update not only hardware, but software. So we've got hard cost estimates. We've just started in the last 6 months, we've just started to upgrade to this new software, but it's something that we're able to do. We don't have to do it all at the same time, but we're trying to have a clear path to move forward and switch to this latest version. So that is the largest amount of cost. We also have some interior locks to be replaced. We have some exterior security cameras, and in some areas, we know we can harden the entrances, kind of create a better vestibule system. So we're looking at a couple of case-by-case improvements there. And then the area that's not as well defined is some funding towards improving the exterior security. And Nick had mentioned that we had just received a safety audit that we had a consultant who was actually recommended by the school resource officer that does work throughout the country. We had a study done, I think it was 4 to 5 years ago. So this is the latest set of eyes, and they did 2 of our schools so far, and based on trying to prioritize recommendations, we would also have some dollars there for that. So that's a quick overview of what we're looking at. And then, last but not least, Latimer Lane boiler replacement. While we have a Latimer Lane renovation project that has been pushed out further, the boiler is something that we just need to make sure that we are maintaining, and we'd be looking to upgrade these original boilers to a more energy efficient gas condensing system, as we've done at Henry James and also at Tooten Hills. So that would also include better building management system, and that's the last of our projects for 1819. Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bert.
So in terms of where we go next,
Well, I've been checking. IT was trying to recover, sorry, IT was trying to recover our presentation for us, and we have no word from them yet.
Okay.
So we could just continue to do the capital and
Yeah.
CNR recap and come back to town manager's office. And ultimately, if IT is not able to recover our final version of the presentation, I just asked Melissa to jump in, and I think the two of us can wing it and in concept cover everything that we had intended to cover, and apologize for that very strange technology glitch, so.
Yeah.
Okay, great, well, I'll
So
put
what
this
you're
in
saying
there.
is you want to cut the IT budget 14%?
Yeah, what'd you do,
It's very
Buzz?
strange. I'm trying to figure out what happened, but they're trying to work on it for us, because that was a much earlier version, so, but, okay,
okay.
great. Right, now I'm nervous. So we did have each of our departments cover CNR and capital within their individual presentations, but since it is a long day, we thought it would be helpful, again, just to recap for you, have the slides available as part of any conversation or follow-up you might have on capital non-recurring. And this will be a joint effort with Jeff as well, so if you have questions, Jeff may, chime in, and he's available as a resource. So again, a quick recap for the CNR fund, what we included this year. We included capital expenditures that were under $100,000. Those were also one-time expenditures such as studies and the funding for revaluation. Revenue sources was a general fund contribution to CNR for $416,250. We also did a transfer in from capital. This was cash. This is technically also a general fund contribution, but a general fund contribution coming in from capital of $176,500. As we mentioned earlier in the day, based on a revised estimate for the proposed irrigation system feasibility study, that cost was reduced from $100,000 to $40,000. So as a result, for the purposes of today, we reflected that cost in CNR for you due to the dollar value of the study.
Can we go back to the revenue sources for a second?
Sure.
Just so I understand, because, and I brought it up at the last meeting, but traditionally, our CNR fund, our 416, is a multiple year payback, right? It's a 5-year payback, so we fund 20% of it a year. So we're proposing the 416 is still funded in the traditional manner, right?
Correct.
So the 176 is not, we're not paying ourselves back over 5 years? So we're calling it CNR, but it's not CNR as we know it, but we're approving it through CNR, but it's actually just, we're buying something outright for 176.
Right, so we had a number of smaller capital items this year, and those, again, are capital items under $100,000, and we just had a
Yep.
lot of, again, those smaller capital needs. And so we did have available cash in capital, and so we had talked about, well, could we just then make a contribution of cash from capital to CNR to fund these smaller items, as opposed to charging these smaller items off to the capital fund directly?
I guess, just, it's the same thing, isn't it? I mean, we're paying cash for it one way or another. I guess,
We could
just from a,
budget it in either
The
place.
appropriation would be made out of the CNR, technically from a accounting standpoint, the appropriation would be made out of what we call the 300 account from the CNR accounts. But then on the revenue side of the ledger, the 176 would come straight from the cash for capital side. So you could do this, I mean, it is the same as having either a bundle of 176 and a capital item, the way we've done it in the past.
Yeah.
And just bring cash for that. There's no difference.
I get the accounting of it, I guess from an appearance standpoint, as everybody's heard me rally for 6 years, we just need to be very careful because not everybody understands CNR and that it's not an endless account. It has to be funded, and a couple of years ago, the Board of Finance realized it was underfunded and had to fix it. So I wouldn't want this board or future boards to think that we spent $552 out of the CNR fund. I understand it as it's presented today, but in the budget book, it says 552, and if somebody goes back, no, you spent 552 out of the CNR account. 3 people in this room understand it, 5, or you guys understand the accounting of it, but, you know, the sheet of paper says 5, and I'm not trying to be a nitpicker here, but, you know, as long as we're comfortable that nobody's gonna think we're spending 552 out of the CNR fund itself in the future, doesn't make much difference to me, as long as everybody's clear. Does that make sense, Eric? It's just, you guys?
It does. What are your thoughts, Maria?
You know, again, I think as long as folks are clear in terms of understanding the revenue source, and again, ultimately, if perhaps, you know, you all or Board of Finance felt differently and said, well, even though they're smaller capital items, if we're using the cash from capital, we'd rather just budget for those expenses in capital and pay for them. I mean, that's certainly something we could do as well. Again, we were just sort of using that threshold of projects under 100,000 and generally, you know, been charged to CNR. But again, if, you know, folks feel like the revenue source piece isn't clear or necessarily transparent to folks who don't sort of do our work on a day-to-day basis, and, you know, there's a preference to just budget and pay for those smaller capital items directly out of capital, I mean, that's something we could certainly do as
A
well.
couple of years ago, we had it broken out separately, items we were gonna pay cash for.
We, yeah, even last year, right, at
Yeah.
the actual approvals. Now, the other place you could go to, if you go to tab 23 in your binders, I did add a little more detail than I had last year, especially because this one-time funding. This is, I don't know if this would alleviate your concerns, but if you see this list recommended cash to capital funding at the bottom, I know it's
Yeah.
slightly different with
One-time
100,000.
CNR.
That last item says one-time CNR funding. That's the delta between the 416 and what was the, you know, before the irrigation study was moved back in here. But that number that number ties, that 2176, you'll notice, ties to up above halfway through the cash for capital under town
Yeah,
manager
no.
recommended. So they'd have to replace, like, instantly, if someone tried to say propose 550,000, they're not gonna have any source for it.
I guess my real point is, you're not gonna be here next year. I know you are and you are, but again, we spent 4 budget hearings a few years ago fighting with then the first selectman and finance director at the time about what CNR was, what CNR isn't. It was a colossal waste of time. It was very confusing. And not suggesting that anything's going on here, but it's just, this is not a topic that's generally understood. It's confined to the municipal space. So again, I'm fine with however you want to do it, just, you know, maybe just from a presentation standpoint, it's 416, draw a line on this, because right now, again, it's bundling up to 552 on the budget packet, and it just, it gives, you know, the illusion that we're spending 552 out of CNR. I understand we're not, but just from a clarity standpoint, and again, we got new people all over the place, I just want to make sure that we're being consistent on a year-over-year basis. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'll move on.
No.
No, I would agree with that. We
CNRs,
really want to be
my thing.
transparent because, I mean, I'm just going through and the previous, what is it, tab 28 shows 552, but it's really 592. And when I go to refer to this halfway through the year to say, what did we do? The numbers don't jive.
Right, and so that 552 versus 592, that was that new development we referenced today with the irrigation study and that 40.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we
Next,
should,
I thought.
for Monday night, Sean, like we've done in the past, get new
Corrected pages.
pages.
Absolutely.
Well, I think cash to capital is confusing on its own for most people, you know, they don't understand where that's coming from. You know, we're not just pulling cash out and spending it wherever we want. It's, this is part of the plan, so I think it might be easier to understand and explain when we get to having to explain it to the public for a referendum, things like that, if it's broken out. I don't know, Sean, I just
I mean, yeah, no,
thought it
I'm
was.
definitely, it's something we've talked a lot about. I mean, the other option, if we wanted to be more consistent with years past, we could bundle some of these as, I don't know if it's the town manager's office studies or whatever. If you'd be more comfortable seeing them as we have in the past on the capital plan, but just funded with cash. And keep the CNR at the same number. It ultimately, again, I guess I don't care too strongly.
Because that's really what it is, it's capital funded with cash, but,
Either way, it's,
you know,
Yeah.
right, cash, it's cash for capital. In this case, it's, because they're smaller items, is really the
Reason why we
biggest
budgeted.
reason they're on the CNR fund.
no, I understand that, but
Yeah.
the distinction might be lost on.
Sure. We can take a look at that.
And really what you mean is, when you say capital, you mean capital non-reoccurring. So we should call it that, because then anybody can look at it and say, well, no, it's really, it's going here. Because if you were to just tell me off the street, well, it's really cash for capital, I'm gonna go, what's the difference?
So back to your prior point, so the Simsbury Farm golf course improvements, that's the 100K in cash for in the 5-year capital plan right now? That's
Yes.
the one that's going from 100 down to 40.
40, correct.
Right, but are we moving that to this proposed,
The proposal is that 40 then moves
We're gonna do cash.
so that's where that's where that 592 comes in?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Because it was reduced, and therefore we're gonna use it as cash. Worth versus property.
All right,
So
I'll be
then-
quiet.
Yeah, so then the overall capital budget would be reduced by about 60.
I'm not kidding, we spent 4 meetings on this one year.
Cash for capital or cash for gold? Is that the commercial?
As opposed to Cole's cash.
It's like, come on.
So again, a quick recap of studies or technical assistance, the economic development study, our response to deepwater wind, radio system feasibility study, the golf course irrigation feasibility study, as well as year 1 of funding for reval. There were a few fleet replacements in CNR. A number of equipment replacements that were reviewed this morning, as well as some repairs to the Eno Hall stairway and railings. So again, that was just our recap on CNR for you. And then these budget numbers for revenue and expenditures reflect the change in the golf course irrigation study. So these numbers have been reduced by that. And again, these were discussed this morning. But again, the one I just want to point out on this capital fund major projects is the expansion of the multi-use trail. So this was the connector piece between Bloomfield and Simsbury. We did have funds budgeted for design. Simsbury and Bloomfield are sharing in that cost. So design will be underway. The problem or the uncertainty right now is whether or not that state grant is actually going to come. And I chatted a bit with Phil Shank about this over in Bloomfield, and we continue to get conflicting opinions from various state officers and about this particular issue. So again, we remain optimistic. This would be a wonderful project to do, but whether or not the grant actually gets rescinded is yet to be seen. But even if it does get rescinded, at least the design, will be complete. And then we can talk about, potential other sources of funding for that down the road. And again, the greenway improvements and the various improvements under Public Works were discussed earlier this morning.
Maria, I don't know if now's the best time to talk about it, but the $60,000 in the economic development study, is there, after this whole thing is presented, would it make more sense to talk about it then, if we think that might, if we have a question about that amount?
Sure. So where I came up with a $60,000 estimate as a starting point, I had envisioned some sort of potential community engagement piece for
Yeah.
you all. If you want to go more of sort of the strategic plan route, probably having, again, some community engagement. And that could be in many different ways. That could be through focus groups, that could be through open houses, it could be through online surveys. There are a number of ways that we could do that. My experience with doing some various studies over the last few years where there's a community engagement component, I think budgeting at least 60 is probably a reasonable estimate. If we're going to proceed with just straight out technical assistance, if we're not envisioning having a facilitator help us with the visioning process or having a community engagement process, then I would say, okay, we could probably drop that number down a bit, maybe more to 40 to 45. But again, I think if you're wanting to see some sort of facilitated community visioning
Sure.
process as well as that engagement component, that we're probably looking at a number of 60 at least would be my ballpark
My
estimate.
question on that was that bless you, we don't know obviously exactly what the process is going to look like and what the scope of that work is going to be. But there's been a ton of work on the economic development front over the years. So I don't know if that amount would reflect a less mature process, if we hadn't already done what we've done up to this point. But part of me would think, well, we could budget it and have the option to spend that if the process called for it, but we don't have to, for sure. Sean?
Yeah, and I guess to follow on that, so we've done the charrette, albeit it's getting dated at this point. We've done the master marketing plan, I think there was a phase 2 or a phase 3 that we didn't fund.
Did the town center.
We did the town center, we've done WeTog, or we're doing WeTog.
We did the Hartford.
Did the Hartford,
Harvard.
what, I guess, what is this gonna accomplish that's different or better or gonna direct us from what we've already done? And again, I'm open to it, you
Yeah.
know, because stuff does get stale and opinion changes, but again, I mean, we spent a lot of money on a charrette. We put people in a room, we promised them a lot of stuff, we put a road through my church. We did a lot of different things, that still bothers me, by the way. You know, there was a lot of things we did through that, and I mean, we got this community all riled up, and then we haven't done a lot with that. So,
I think in fairness to Maria, we put in her contract the piece around economic development planning, and I think she needs direction from this board as far as
Well,
what that's gonna look like.
I think a lot of those efforts are chunks that are bricks of maybe a master plan, I mean, but they were the charrette was specific to something that was narrowly defined. I think we're all over the place with economic development. I think we have no consensus in this
Agreed.
community. I think when you begin to talk about details, you get 100 different directions. And I think it's, I think I feel personally, and I feel I've heard from this group, that a really well-done, comprehensive, creative plan that reflects collaboration in the community around economic development is important. I think it's going to have to be a facilitated process. And to me, we have a lot of stuff on the stove. We don't have the overall meal, so to speak. So,
that's a good way to put it.
so I support the idea of having something in there, and I think when you begin to look at consulting and facilitation, you get to 60,000 pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah.
Might
I'm
be
not-
too much, and we don't have to spend it all, but I do completely understand why we have something in here for that purpose.
I mean, I'm actually worried about the opposite, Chris. I mean, wasn't the charrette like $250,000? I mean, for just the town center? I mean, it's candidly, for what you laid out, you're right, but is that anywhere near enough money for that? I mean,
Well, that
it's-
charrette was very technical, right?
Understood, but I mean, it's
So
costing us
this is-
$400,000
yeah.
for the master plan just to look at our 40 buildings, right? I mean, consultants are not cheap.
No, I know, but I actually think this is a more global strategic review. The town center was, I think, a pretty sophisticated, complicated, technically oriented,
Okay.
had to be highly detailed.
Okay.
This is just my sense.
Yeah, no,
It's a good conversation, but I actually envision this being probably a little bit less detail-driven, so to speak.
And all of those pieces could be reviewed by the eventual
Absolutely,
consultant
yeah.
as part of their process of trying to figure out where we go from here.
Yeah.
Because right now, you're right, we have a bunch of things sitting on the shelf.
Yeah.
And no specific
We have-
direction with how to use that.
We have a bunch of, this is my opinion, we have a bunch of things sitting on the shelf, and we have a community who thinks that economic development right now is high-density housing and assisted living, and that's
Right.
all that that's all that people see.
And a
So
Dunkin'
we need-
Donuts.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
yeah, so, and maybe a few nail salons, so then we
Right.
need to move that along.
So I'm not challenging the 60, I just want to make sure that we have a narrative so that, especially when we're in front of the Board of Finance, that we can understand how it fits into the picture.
Right, understandable. And again, this is meant to serve as a placeholder,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
coming up in the very near future, we'll have it as a future agenda item for you all to talk about in terms of your vision and how you might like to use those funds and how you'd like to proceed with moving forward in terms of developing an economic development, again, strategy or strategic plan. But again, for budgeting purposes, I felt that it was important to at least set aside some money, and then you as a board can decide how you really would like to, focus your efforts and energy, and we can develop an RFQ and get more sophisticated about what that scope of work will look
Yeah.
like. But I just didn't want, this particular priority, which I know is important to you, to then not have any funds in the
Yeah.
upcoming budget process, so.
Yeah, well put, thank you.
Yeah. Great. Sean, did you want to just speak briefly to the
favorite
capital
slide.
policy and?
Before we do
Love
this
this
one,
one.
can we
Oh,
can we
yes.
just finish up with CNR?
Oh, sure.
Sorry, you know how I love it. So we've got 50 grand for the legal and consulting fees for Deepwater Wind in
Yes.
CNR.
Correct.
There's a lot of places we can put that. Overall, we think this is the best place for it because it's truly gonna be a non-recurring item versus putting it in our legal or consulting budget.
Right, and again, we did put it in CNR. If we think that this has the potential to go on year after year, and we're going to be continually adding to it. We could potentially budget for it out of capital. This would be an addition. It could include legal expenses, but it could also include some of the other work that we've been talking about in terms of monitoring and peer review work. And as you all saw probably from the board packet that was released on Thursday, just current year expenses year to date now, we're at a little over $50,000. So again, some of the toughest work I think is now behind us in terms of our response and that prep work. But again, just trying to be responsible and budget some additional funds for the response. We felt like this would be a good starting point. And again, depending on where you're comfortable budgeting that, if you'd prefer to see it in operating versus capital versus CNR, I think we can help you work through that and figure out where you would feel most comfortable seeing that allocation.
No, I have no objection to it. I think it makes sense because I'm very much hopeful this is a non-recurring item. Maybe my only caution might be with the Board of Finance is this number may go up. This is our best guess right now based on where we are, based on our response, but as we've talked about, the appeal process is not a short process. It's potentially a labor-intensive process. There are other avenues and the monitoring alone can cost us significant dollars. And again, much like the economic development study, this is our best guess at this point.
Right.
But these numbers will likely evolve, right? So, okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
And then, did you all have questions on the out years?
For capital? Yeah. I do. So there's a presumption, Sean, right, and Maria, that the cash availability stays, and that's what this slide talks about, right?
Well, stays, but right, it reduces.
Right.
Right now, everything that you see on your fold-out page here is incorporated in the model that we're familiar with at this point. And as you can see, in the fiscal 19 budget we're planning, we have a significant amount of cash available if we budget or work our way back up to the 7% line. And the goal here has been knowing that, as currently proposed, in 2024, 2025, our debt service, actual debt service principal and interest will return to a 7% level, which is the sort of cap Board of Finance debt service policy establishes. So before then, as we talked about before, in terms of level budgeting or smoothing this increase, this generates cash availability. That's obviously this year the principal interest payments are only $4 million. That's where the 2.2 roughly comes from, as proposed. So, but yeah, I mean, certainly it's something to be cognizant of as you look at 2024 and 2025. If something like the plow truck or something that you know you're going to need to do in those future years, you tend to pay cash for that. We are modeling out, and there's a lot of variables, but in the next 4 or 5 years, that cash availability will be squeezed out, again, with a variety of assumptions, including what the budget is at that time, because it's obviously 7% of that budget, but that's what the model currently shows.
And that projection includes the senior center out there or no?
It includes the senior center as proposed on the
2023.
summary here, which is now out in 2023,
2023.
but at an increased number from where it was last.
Well, that's why those years that you're showing
That's the
as
pink.
hitting the
Yeah.
line are the
It does.
senior center coming, that's the senior center coming in, or is that not?
That's part of the senior, part of the senior center is reflected in that issuance. I believe half of it is modeled to be in the 2024 impact there. But depending on when, again, it's back to cash flow, and if that project was spread over 2 years, some of that blank space out in 2026, 2027, it's not to say there won't be projects there. It's not to say the entire senior center project will be included. I believe at this time, most of it is included in that tranche in the pink, but obviously there's a lot of variables between now and the next 4 years.
So Sean, what's the total cash contribution available this year? It looks like two, a little bit over,
Available, meaning,
on that
Agreed.
chart
On that
right
model,
You
there.
mean to get back up to
Right, so-
7% available?
Yes, to get
if we were to
to,
go, so that's actually not at 7% for fiscal 19, that is at, as you can, I think it's like 6
3?
point. Where's the sheet? And what we're using as an assumption,
we're still 6.8 is what we're assuming for,
it would be lower, it would be lower than that.
says 6.4, or what does that say on the bottom?
I don't see what it says.
It says
Oh, some
6.4
6.4
in
duration
FY '19.
in fiscal year 19.
Budget anyway.
Yeah, let me make sure.
And 7 debt ratio cap.
We're in the fives right now, right?
Yeah, that doesn't tell you what it is.
Right.
no.
So if you answered my question, this is below 7%.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is,
And
and
that's,
it's an important distinction too, is that technically the debt service policy is just principal and interest, right? So
Right.
we've used the delta there, for the smoothing. We're actually, under the terms of the debt policy, we're at 4.19% for fiscal 19, right? Our
Right.
principal interest payments will be 4.19% of budget. However, knowing that the current plan has us going up to 7% again, that excess amount is what we're budgeting for cash. So technically, and I have debt plus cash for capital at 6.43% under the current proposal.
right. So I've never been a fan of being down that low personally, but that's not my decision to make, but
No, I agree with you, because it sets up for, and
Yeah.
what people don't understand is, it was as we talked about last year, it was a one-time temporary savings. But as everybody heard me drone on about last year, we're gonna have to go back up this year, and that was a tax
Exactly.
increase, that was a budget
yes,
increase.
yeah. And you have interest rates going up
Right.
at the same time, so is
So
it
now
your,
we're losing on interest.
right.
And this whole plan is predicated upon the Board of Ed, or excuse me, the Board of Finance going with 15-year bonds, not 10-year, presuming
Right.
Henry James is approved, right, at the
Which
full
is the
amount.
Henry James project, that's right.
Yeah.
Which is the
Which-
dark blue.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's precedent for that. We did the high school on a longer term, because for the same reason, to smooth in, and I think we'd enjoyed some pretty decent
And
rates.
interestingly, it
why we're
fell
looking
off
good
this
now.
year, so that you see the difference between the black between 18 and 19. That's the high school,
The high
it's the
school.
15th year of the high school falling out, so it's interesting timing that we're now replacing with another, probably the second largest project in the last.
Yep.
And the only project in recent years that we've done 15-year bonds on would have been the high school and potentially Henry James.
Yeah.
And I don't, I support doing a Board of Ed project over 15 years. I'd be really resistant to doing normal town, other bonding at that term. Thanks.
So just because Maria, you asked about the out years, so only as you articulated here, I'm looking at the 5-year capital plan, only the first year where it says cash is cash. All the out years are potentially cash, but maybe debt, we don't know, so it all adds up to that.
Yeah, we changed the label there to first year source of funds in the past.
Yep. Because once we issue Henry James, we chew up a significant amount of capacity, and then once we issue the year after Henry James, we've pretty much eliminated debt service flexibility.
Right.
That's the other side of the coin.
All right.
All right, well, we are going to hop back to the last bit of the operating budget. Unfortunately, we do not have an update from IT, so our day was just going so smoothly, and so bear with us a little bit, and again, I'll ask Melissa to help jump in, and I apologize that you're seeing one of our earlier versions of our new departmental budget. All right. So for the town manager's office budget, key services and programs here are now that, as the chief administrative officer for the town, we are overseeing the day-to-day municipal operations for our town government. We are implementing policies and initiatives. We are also responsible for the human resources function for the town organization. And we are also responsible for the risk management function for the organization. And so that also includes items such as our workers' compensation insurance and program, as well as our general liability insurance and program. And we are currently members of KERMA. And we are pretty actively involved with that organization. Coincidentally, I had served on the O&D, which is Operations and Underwriting Committee for KERMA, with Tom Cook. And KERMA has since, Tom was actually the most recent chair, and since his departure, KERMA has asked me to step in as chair. So there's definitely some continuity there, as that was a subcommittee that I was actively involved in my prior life, but that Tom Cook was also actively involved in. So I think that does add a lot of value to us to stay on top of those particular issues. So, we're gonna come back to general government, sorry. And we're gonna get that. All right, sorry, I'm just skipping around a little bit. So for budget highlights, in particular, we changed what was administrative services and, central administration. What was the central administration budget? We changed to the town manager's office. So again, there were a number of coding changes that didn't necessarily have an impact on the overall budget, but now these are expenses that were budgeted formally in a different place as we're trying to, again, centralize and make manager's office expenses show up in one centralized place. So one of these coding changes was in part-time salaries. There was traditionally money for commission clerks that was showing up under the central administration budget. We thought that it made sense to budget for commission clerks under the Board of Selectmen budget. So this would be, for example, clerks covering your meetings as well as some of our other commissions. We've also historically had part-time money, salary money budgeted for seasonal, which were interns and temporary help in the manager's office to assist when the executive assistant would be out of the office on vacation or something of that nature. So we felt that obviously that fund, or those funds that were budgeted for that purpose, made sense to show up in the manager's office budget. As Sean mentioned earlier, in the finance department budget, part of the Deputy Director of Administrative Services salary was being budgeted in the finance department. We have now consolidated in one place where the salary for the Deputy Town Manager is now showing up in the Town Manager's office. And that, again, the full cost of that position is now showing up in the Manager's office budget. There was a decrease in contractual services funds. The expenses related to the town manager search had been budgeted within the operating budget for the current year, so we do not need those funds moving forward. Also, under the manager's office, we reallocated the funds for the graduate intern program. Previously, those funds were showing up in the finance office. I felt more comfortable having those expenses show up under the manager's office. Typically, moving forward, I will have the graduate student intern not only helping with financial assignments, but human resources assignments, the annual report, special projects and analytical work. So I felt that it made sense to, again, reallocate those existing expenses to the manager's office. That's a program I think that adds a lot of value to the organization because we're getting highly skilled individuals at a very low cost. And of course, I do speak highly of the MPA program. Myself, Melissa, Sean, and Burke are actually all graduates of the program. And again, I think, we're very fortunate in that we're getting, again, highly skilled folks at a very low cost. We also, under contractual services, had a very small, about $200 increase for our NeoGov recruitment software system that we use. That's the ongoing annual maintenance fee, and we did experience a very small increase there as well.
I don't know if we can tolerate that, that's too much.
So trends and challenges, for the manager's office. For the upcoming fiscal year, I do envision a significant amount of time is going to be spent with our 3 new department heads. I want them to be successful in the organization and to be successful in their new position. So providing adequate support for onboarding them and orienting them, and again, helping them be successful in their new position. So I do anticipate with that transition will come, considerable time and energy and support. We will be spending a lot of time on the human resources function this coming year. We'll need to initiate and then wrap up negotiations with our police officers union. But we also have a number, as you can see, a number of agreements, I believe 4, that are coming due for June 30th of next year. So we will be negotiating a significant amount of contracts. Along with that, once they're settled, becomes the time and energy around implementing any changes. So any changes to wages, any retro payments and calculations, any benefits changes, all of that does take a considerable amount of work. So we will be busy on the HR front for the coming year. Now we're going to go back to our areas of focus. So we mentioned earlier under the CNR discussion, another piece for us is working on developing an economic development strategy for you, as well as our continued response to deep water wind. We would like to conduct a leadership retreat for the department head team with a focus on leadership development and supervisory training. So one of the service improvements that I had proposed was $5,000. We have that in a general government budget as opposed to the manager's office. But again, in speaking with some of the members of our leadership team, I think that this is a particular area that we can improve upon. Again, I think in public sector, sometimes we promote folks because they're technically competent, but then we don't necessarily give them the resources and skills that they need to be successful managers and leaders. And I think that spending some resources in this area and making an initial investment would be tremendously helpful. If we were to be given the funds to do that service enhancement, again, I would like to start off with an annual leadership retreat. I was thinking particularly if we had a leadership retreat this fall, I'm a big fan of the DISC assessment, which I know you all used with me. I was a fan of that before that process. And I was envisioning potentially 2 educational sessions with the department head team, one being a DISC assessment of everybody and how that affects their leadership style, and an afternoon session on conflict styles and assessment and management of conflict. And then on day 2 to have a half-day session on visioning. So what's working well, what's not working well, how can we do things better? If there's a bit of funds left over from that, I'd like to try and do an additional supervisory training for staff members. But ongoing, again, if we were able to slowly build up that amount of money a little bit over time, I also see executive coaching as something that can be particularly helpful to staff members and team members, particularly if they're struggling in certain areas of their work. So again, looking at this source of revenue to fund an annual leadership retreat, supervisory training, and potentially executive coaching for our team members. Another area that's important to me is complying with the Freedom of Information Act. So something that Melissa and I have been working on is we want to set up a training for all of our staff and invite our board and commission members as well. We would like to implement an FOI policy where we would create a centralized process for receiving requests and processing those requests. And it's also important to me that as part of good government, that we are ensuring that we are providing responses in a timely manner and that we are helping our residents and our citizens get access to the documents that they're looking for. So this is an area that I think we can improve our capacity a bit on, and I'd like to spend some time with the organization and focus on this. We'd also like to spend some time in areas of focus on our administrative procedures and written policies. A few in particular that I'm particularly interested in are developing a policy around professional travel, a written policy around mileage reimbursement. We'd like to work on our inclement weather policy, which was last updated in 2009, and our records management plan, which I think Erica spoke beautifully to this morning, so I won't reiterate and rehash that. And then a couple of areas of focus, that didn't make it to this particular version of the slide. We're also working on improvements to our annual report format and content and trying to modernize that. And something that's important to me is that we are producing and publishing that document in a more timely and relevant, so the information is more relevant and that we're not, publishing it nearly a whole year after the previous fiscal year. So we presented some recommended changes to the Board of Finance at their last meeting, in which they were very supportive of. So we are now going to be working on the fiscal 16-17 annual report, incorporating those changes. But that my goal moving forward is that we will be working on the in this case, 17-18 annual report. We'll start working on that in August and to do our best to have that document published no later than December. So again, that annual report project is something that we are working on and anticipate spending some time on. Another area of focus for us as well is the monthly newsletter. Formerly, the First Select Woman's Office was publishing a monthly newsletter. I think for capacity reasons, we would be looking to do a scaled-down version of that, but that is another area of focus for us, as we'd like to try and work on continuing that with probably some assistance from our graduate student intern.
That was very diplomatic of you. Got to be like this by the time.
Right, it definitely, I think, serves an important function, but just again, for capacity, I don't think we would be able to produce something to that, scale and extent.
I appreciate the efficiency gain there. That's a wise choice of a resource there.
A couple months ago, Melissa did some, works with IT and did some analytics to look at how many times, every time it came out, how many times it was downloaded. And I forget what the exact number was, but it surprised me, actually, how many people appear to be using it. So,
Downloaded or pushed to, because it came out
no,
via
we
email.
know how many it was pushed to, but we know how many people went to that page, presumably to download it.
Fishing.
That's what they got when they opened it.
Big red.
Inflated numbers. Fishing.
So another change that we made to our budgeting document was we changed, it was a budget called Administrative Services, but most of what was charged to that particular budget were just general costs of sort of doing business. So we've renamed it to General Government, and primarily what's reflected in there are we now the postage for all of our departments, with the exception of special revenue funds. So postage is now all in one place, so it's easy to get a handle on as an organization, how much are we spending for postage? Again, that's just sort of a cost of doing business. Our phone system has been budgeted there for quite a while. Our copiers, the paper for those copiers, those sorts of things. So this is essentially a budget that's reflective of just some of those general costs of doing business. There was some travel money for what is now manager's office staff that was budgeted in this particular program budget, so we have reallocated those funds to the manager's office budget. And we were also cognizant of the fact, again, that having a town manager is new, and we made sure to budget within the town manager's budget a few of the contractual pieces of my employment agreement, again, so there would be no surprises. We were, again, cognizant of what was negotiated in that agreement and made sure that we budgeted for that accordingly. Oh, thank you so much, Melissa. Thank you. Yes. And so general government, since the leadership development piece would be an organization-wide initiative, we did put that service enhancement money in this particular budget. So for the Board of Selectmen / Community Services budget, and this looks like a very large increase, but
I was
this
gonna
gets
say, you gave us a large increase in the whole budget book.
Sorry. So we were trying to think where was the most appropriate place?
I don't think I didn't notice that.
Yeah, we can change this. We can change this.
He respects it.
Contractual negotiated salary.
Yeah, exactly. That's the top line, special activities, 0%.
And again, we could talk about where it's best to put public agency support. And so when we were thinking about, again, community support, again, we have this existing Board of Selectmen / Community Services budget. So we're doing our best to get a handle on all of the outside agencies that we are providing subsidies to their operations. And so what we were able to do for all of the non-social services related agencies, we put them all here. Again, just so they are in one place, and again, if you are a member of the public, you can easily get a handle on what that total dollar amount looks like. So that is why the increase looks so small, so large. Again, these were previously scattered all throughout the budget. And we've also included dues and subscriptions for membership organizations, again, that are benefiting the entire organization or community. So these would be things like CCM, I believe CROG is in there, COST, and as I mentioned earlier, for commission clerks, those folks sort of needed a home under the new form of government. And since they're supporting the work of the various boards, in particular this board, we thought that might be a good place for coding purposes to house that.
So dues and subscription is Kerma, CROG, cost,
Not KERMA, so
Not
it'd be
KERMA.
CCM,
CCM, sorry.
COST, CROG. Oh, yes, the $75 membership for, correct.
Okay.
And then the Chamber of Commerce membership.
Okay. And then the public agency support, you guys have that
Yes, we
broken
do
out?
have a slide on that for you.
Chamber of Commerce.
And this might be a nice segue into this. So these are the agencies that are currently receiving support from us. And this reflects the requested amounts from those agencies for the upcoming fiscal year. As I mentioned, for the handful of agencies that are human services in nature, we budgeted for those in Kristen's budget, and she presented on that earlier this morning. I should also footnote, this is an evolving issue as we keep peeling back the layers. And in addition to this 151, We've discovered that there's about another $12,000 supporting social service agencies that are coming out of a trust fund that we have in social services. So it's not coming out of the general fund, it's not coming out of revenue we're receiving from the property tax, but that VNA is receiving an additional $7,000 through one of our trusts, as well as Meals on Wheels. They are receiving about $5,000 a year through one of our trusts. But again, these are our general fund expenses related to public agency support that are reflected in this particular chart.
These are, I mean, somewhat in line with past.
Correct.
Yeah.
I have a
see
comparison
them all
here,
in
so.
there, though.
Correct, exactly.
And one thing we
right.
talked a little bit about is creating a more formal process for these organizations to approach us.
Exactly, right. So with Kristen's help, we sort of did our best to
Main Street should
pilot
pull
with the
out.
human services organizations a sample application form. Again, I came on really late in the budgeting process, but I was somewhat uncomfortable making agency recommendations to you when I didn't have any good data on the services that these folks were providing to our residents, what their other funding sources were, if these agencies were financially solvent. I mean, there are just a whole host of issues and information that I just felt like I didn't have a good handle on. And, you know, moving forward, I would like to develop a much more formal application process for our outside agencies, make it a competitive process, and have, you know, a much more thorough review that's based on data and analysis before making a recommendation to you. So again, with the human services agencies, we do have some of that basic information from them now, which is helpful, and I do have copies of that, if that's something you're interested in seeing. With our other agencies, again, just with me coming on so late into the budget process, we were not able to pilot an application with them and work with them on that. So we do not have that level of detail from the other agencies. But again, I think it's just something we should focus on for next year for the budgeting process and continue to work to refine the application process for these folks.
Maria, can I- So, there's two on here that we had pulled off last year as part of our ultimate reduction of 100,000. One was, I thought there was a small contribution that we made to the Visitors Bureau.
Oh, so they operate by the chamber?
Well, no, there's the
Farmington
chamber.
Valley, you
No,
mean?
the Farmington Valley
went out of
Tourism
business.
District. We actually made and we pulled that out last year. And
Now
then,
they're out of business.
and then we also, right, they're out of business. And then we had the contribution to the Visitors Bureau.
Visitors Center.
Through the
Yeah.
chamber.
Yeah.
So I guess the question, the only relevant question of those two is the chamber.
Right, if you, that is something, if you wanted to sort of flag as a parking lot item. I did not recall seeing a formal request for them for current year, but then again, as we were going through the budgeting process, sort of late in that process, we received the email about current year. So again, I think that was 5,000 that may have been budgeted in the
right.
past. So that would definitely be something we could flag for a parking lot item for later
Yeah.
today.
That'd be a parking lot item for me personally, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And just from a historical standpoint, so the Simsbury Volunteer Ambulance Association, that's the first time we budgeted in the operating side. We went last year to the Board of Finance, we asked them, I think, for 70, or 80, sorry, and
They gave us 50.
they turned us down for 80, but gave us 50, with the understanding that that was a one-time cash contribution, and that we would be back during this budget cycle with this recommendation. Melissa in particular spent way more time than she probably should have at our direction, trying to get down to their financials, the call volume, stuff that we've all talked about in the past. So that's
That was great information, though.
been the
Melissa
most
did.
vetted organization I think that we've
It
done
was.
business with.
And we're also very lucky because Maria has recently done a project in her former town on this subject.
Yeah.
Yes, so just an odd thing, I was involved with helping to, so for paramedic level service out in the region I was at formerly, it was provided out of the hospital, and so the towns as a region were renegotiating the paramedic level rates that were charged back to the communities with Wyndham Hospital, and setting up a proper governance structure for that. And so, long story short, but oddly enough, I was involved in that process, so this is an area I have a little bit of knowledge
Yeah.
in. And something that Melissa was very helpful in. I asked her to go back to the Ambulance Association and get some additional information. I think she showed me the analysis that we did on call volume, and she did a fantastic job on the call volume piece. Where I felt we still needed some further information moving forward was more so around the fees that are being charged, at what rate they're recovering those fees. Yeah, I think that there's some additional work that we could do more around those, how we're billing, or excuse me, how they are billing, again, how they are collecting those funds. So we did request some additional information for them to help flush some of that out more on the revenue piece of their work. And again, I think, moving forward, that is such a sizable number. And I think if the town feels that you are committed to providing a sizable contribution to them on an ongoing basis, I would advocate for you all to really think about governance structure and ensuring that this board has a seat at their table if you're going to be providing a subsidy. I think that would be very important.
Yeah.
We did talk to them about potentially being a board member, whether that be you or a representative of the town as part of this discussion. We've also talked about, this is this year's solution, but we talked about, do we fund the ambulance out of capital? Do we use our CNR account? There are a lot of ways we can contribute to that organization that might smooth this out as well. And this was at least this year's solution based on our analysis, but you're absolutely right. There are still more conversations we need to have. They're also, I think, going to be going through a transition. They're experiencing volunteerism issues, as a lot of organizations are, so. And with call volume continuing to go up, the analysis, I think, on both sides of it shows us that they're kind of at that midpoint in terms of being able to fund that second ambulance. There's definitely the need for it, but certainly, at this point, not a reimbursement structure that seems to make sense, so. Certainly not the last conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think our obligation is we're thinking about public dollars toward it, helping make sure that they're sustainable is just to, I think, also looking at other parts of their operation and making sure they're as, efficient as possible in terms of the cost recovery and all that.
Exactly, and I think too, a conversation around expectations for service level, because there are different models around when a paramedic does or does not go to a call. So right now, we are very fortunate and we have a very high level of service, and so a paramedic is being dispatched for all calls. In some communities, they'll say, okay, that first level of response, if it's something, maybe somebody sprained an ankle and they need transport because maybe it's broken, it's not life-threatening, you're gonna get an EMTB crew, but you're not getting the paramedic versus, okay, we've been dispatched for a call where it's cardiac arrest. Now we're also sending, a paramedic level service to accompany that, that initial crew that's responding. So there are different ways and models of providing service. Again, we're very fortunate here. My understanding is that a paramedic is going to all calls. So again, I think, looking at service models, looking at governance structure, looking at how we are billing how they are billing and how they're collecting revenues. Those are some areas I would suggest as probably pieces that we want to look at further.
And I'd point out, we had to use the model of contracting from UConn for paramedic services up until, late 90s, early, 2000s, and the town paid for that service, so, yeah. And they're receptive to all these conversations, I assume you're saying, right? Looking for more financial data, talking about governance and everything.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
And again, I think at least the tone of it is, from the discussions, is they were looking as the town as a short-term solution, but they felt, unfortunately, as call volume increased and as reimbursement rate increases, they would see a better financial position for funding that second ambulance. Again, unfortunately, in the not-too-distant future. So it was anticipated, at least in the initial agreement, that our contribution would probably lessen over time. And we would, again, talk about capital versus operating, because it might be easier for us to contribute to an ambulance every 5 years versus giving them $80,000 every year or something like, so there's, again, this was the solution to get us through the prior, 6 months and the coming 12, with an understanding that the conversation that you're articulating is going to happen, and that we're either going to keep going with this on a diminishing rate, or we're going to go in a different direction of some combination of operating and capital.
I also want to be clear, this is an organization that's provided a very high level of service and, a vital service to our residents for a long time. And I think just as their business model is facing some challenges and the town is working more closely with them, this is just a new opportunity to look at it with a fresh set of eyes.
And I think it is an important issue in that their financial solvency is not a recent development. I did ask if they could provide us with further years audits going even further back. And so I think when we looked at, was it 10 years worth of their last completed audits, they were only financially solvent for 2 of those years. So this is a problem that has been going on obviously for a long period of time, and it's just not resolving on its own. So definitely part of a larger conversation to how can we help them be financially solvent and continue to provide the high level of service that our residents have become accustomed to.
Yeah.
I should have flagged in capital that, year 2 of the plan, fiscal year 20, was a placeholder, for an ambulance.
Is there?
Oh, yeah,
Right.
I noticed
You
that.
may have received mailers, they were doing a capital fund drive for that, they raised around $35,000, to support that. So that would, they are doing that
Yeah.
on their end, trying to raise money for it, but it's,
That's right.
I think their replacement is coming up quicker than we had initially thought. And then we had sort of internal discussions, they had said, year 2 or 3 of our plan, but, I think they're looking to do it within the year.
Wow.
I have a question about another item up there, the North Central Mental Health Board, given our prior conversations and all that. I think we don't have a representative there anymore. Simsbury has always had a representative on the board, and I think
We don't
that
have one at the
we
moment.
have not in the last few years, and I think we should look into that. Because, given what this board has said about having a seat at the table, and being involved in those decisions, I think that's important. So, I don't know that for, 100%, but I am
Thank
pretty
you.
sure that we no longer have a representative there, and we should.
Thank you, we'll definitely look into that.
Good, just going down the line, so the health contractual services, that's the Farmington Valley Health District?
Yes.
And that's not a number we negotiate, that's what we're told by the state to pay?
By the regional, for the health district, that budget is set by the regional health district board.
Basically, we don't have a say, though.
We do, we have
We
two
have
board
one vote,
members.
or two votes.
Melissa and Jeff are actually currently serving and representing Simsbury.
Okay.
So that reflects,
Next time, less than 3% then.
well, we're the only one that had, there's 10 towns in the district, we're the only town that had a population increase, so we're the only ones that, well, I mean, the rate, the per capita cost went from $5.35 to $5.50, which is 2.8%, but our population went up, so.
We're not having more fairs and more inspections, and so, okay. Let's keep that cost down. Because the state tried to monkey with that 2 budget cycles ago, didn't they, where our cost was gonna go up, I think.
They're going to try to further consolidate
Yes.
and,
So keep an eye on that during the budget season, because there's lots of brilliant ideas running around Hartford.
Right. And the Housing Education Resource Center, who is that?
so that is my understanding is a nonprofit agency, and it is one of the organizations that if we do receive a fair housing complaint, that we often use as a referral
Okay, so
and
they're-
resource for us when we're helping folks work through potential fair housing issues.
That's what I thought it was, I just want to make sure.
I got one,
Assuming those represent agencies or boards that we use for
Get services out of
referrals,
Yeah.
And the VNA does provide some direct service to our folks.
They do.
My understanding is they do like a blood pressure clinic, and some things like that for our seniors at the senior center.
I don't know if you're gonna get to it, but special activities for the Board of BOS, is that the parade?
Oh, right, so $6,000 is in the Board of Selectmen Community Services budget for the Memorial Day Parade. Actually, Eric and I just met with those committee members yesterday morning to go over their budget and their plan for the upcoming year. Just a little side note, a plug, it's the 100th anniversary parade, so that's really exciting, and I think that they're doing a terrific job
Yeah.
planning for
Seems
it.
very well organized.
It's the coolest part about this job. Yeah. Besides the budget, of course.
Great. Any other questions on public agency support, or the board budget, or manager's office?
I would just point out, if we added in the $5,000 contribution to the chamber, it's 2 basis points, or, 0.02%. So it's not real significant. It takes our budget from 3.984 to 3.986. So I'm supportive of adding that back in.
I am
So-
too. I think based on what the Visitor Center does for our economic development and our public face, I think that's cheap.
Something we should-
We could offset our electronics budget.
I mean, they have shown, how many people actually walk in the door and they provide information.
I'd be a proponent of trying to find that.
But wasn't it less than 100 people?
But as part of the chamber, they actually provide it.
Understand that, but the metrics that were provided in that letter were not impressive. There was not nearly the volume that I would have expected, given the visits to this town, the concerts, the,
Part of the problem is where that
Restaurants.
door is.
it's not a visitor center. It's the
It's not,
basement of
yeah.
the old
It's the
library. Nobody
basement
knows it's
that-
there,
and
right?
And the other, it's not accessible either.
Right. That's kind of been my issue is
Anybody
we're
who has
funding
an issue with a very
$5,000 for
steep
something that
flight of
people don't know
stairs
about.
Is not able to go in there, and that's one of those things we have to deal with.
The SPAC ticket office would have been something that you could.
Yeah, there's that.
I'm fine with it, but we need to continue to talk about that one because
Yeah,
it's not a visitor center, it's a staff
I
position.
understand that.
And if we're gonna talk about a visitor center, then we need to actually talk about one and make one for real.
But
Whether,
there's also a level of calls that come in there too. It's just
Yeah.
not, it's just not physical.
It's not just the
feet in
physical
door.
presence.
There's a number of, they could probably give us that metric.
my point is, the email was not impressive from a metric standpoint, given the $5,000 contribution. I'm fine with it going back in, but if we're gonna be serious about visitor centers and centralized locations, then let's get serious about it. And let's put it in Eno or here or wherever it should be. But again, the basement of a building that nobody knows you can go into is not a visitor center.
Well, that many people
That's a
cannot
bigger
go into.
conversation, I
Yeah.
think, because that's that's
the
a
chamber
chamber space
space,
as well,
yeah.
so we gotta, that's a whole nother.
And that had been a discussion we had had in the past about where they were gonna go and which impacted, potentially they were talking about going to Eno, but that meant the senior center was gonna have to go somewhere. And all kinds of other issues got involved.
And then maybe it's a better presentation than just a letter.
I think so, because, in my time on the board here, I've been given 3 different answers on what that money's actually going for. So,
So I would suggest fund and further conversation.
Oh, yeah,
It is to
definitely
me.
further
Yep.
conversation, because it's not what it should be.
again, I know it's only $5,000, but we just put an organization out of business by taking our contribution away last year, right, Sherry? So,
Just one quick point on the chamber, and thank you, Sean, for mentioning this. And again, apologies for not having the final version. But in my manager's budget presentation on February 26th, if you might recall, under the economic development sort of area of focus, we had pointed out that we had budgeted $825 for a membership fee to the chamber. That's really common for towns to be actual dues-paying members of their chamber. And we scoured through the budget and we could not find any indication that we were actually dues-paying members to our chamber. So I had put $825 in the budget to be actual dues-paying members of the chamber. So potentially, if you wanted to say, well, we want to fund the $5,000, but we don't need to be dues-paying members, you'd really be only looking for about $4,100 and some change, if you wanted to sort of make
I
up that
thought the chamber
difference.
had considered us
Yeah.
members on a complimentary basis for a long time.
Actually, in the past, they had made various, the town and various other places,
Honorary members.
Honorary members.
honorary members, yes.
I have no problem contributing to it. I think we should be a dues-paying member, especially because we do, we're extended complimentary membership. And again, we have a heavy participation in those events, and it is our chamber, so I don't know a problem with that
Right,
addition.
I would just offer that as an
Yeah.
explanation for why it doesn't appear, because they've never
Yeah.
actually asked us for it
Yeah.
either.
No, it's fine.
So just know that as the budget was presented, the 825 is included, the
Yeah.
5,000. That's all.
Right.
Yeah, and any future conversation, I think, around the $5,000 for the visitor center, to me, has really very little to do with the chamber and more to do with how do we make the best use of tourism money to drive economic development.
Exactly.
Great. And then, so moving on to your discussion and wrap-up. So Sean has been doing a great job of keeping track of the items. But we did prepare for you just a recap on the amount of money that you would need to cut from the budget in order to reach that Board of Finance 1.75% expenditure increase guidance. So that's about $431,000. That number has gone up just slightly based on a few of the coding errors.
7,000, right, yeah.
Yes, that we discovered. So there's a number of ways that we could help you get there, and we would just seek some policy guidance from you all. You could do service reductions to required services, and required services are those things that we are required to do either by federal law, state law, local ordinance, or some contract. We could do service reductions for discretionary programs and services. We could eliminate services or programs that are purely discretionary in nature. We could reduce contributions to our outside agencies, or we could make a recommendation that we're going to deviate from our various existing financial policies and practices. So that could be things like lowering our contribution to fund balance, lowering that debt service and cash to capital number that we were talking about earlier, or funding of liabilities. I know none of these are ideal topics.
That doesn't change our
or
budget, though.
situations, but
What?
again, if you're looking to sort of decrease expenditures, these are some different, ways you could get there. And if there are particular areas you are interested more so on the service reductions or service eliminations, if you give us some guidance in terms of what it is you would like us to look at, we can then cost that out for you and come back with a specific dollar number in terms of what that would equate to.
So just
So
to be
Sean, your
clear,
comment on cash to capital. what
on
do you-
the last one, deviating from existing financial practices, the fund balance debt service, that's not our budget, that's the debt service budget, which is a different line on it, so that doesn't get us to the 175. Right, if we reduced our CNR contribution, that would get us there, because
the
our
cash-
CNR is out of operating.
Well, we have 1.1% of this is the cash to, the
But that's not
cash
in
to-
our budget, Chris, that's in the debt service.
No, I
budget.
understand that.
I mean, it's in
yeah.
the big budget, but not ours, that doesn't add up to the 3.6 or 3.8 or whatever we're at.
And again, I understand that traditionally, capital has not been included in the town budget here. That's not necessarily how it's always done. And so again, if you think it's going to be really hard to get to that number without taking a serious look at capital, then again, perhaps that's just a recommendation that, you could make, that we, lower our capital projects for the year. Again, none of these I know are ideal
Yeah.
situations, and they're difficult to talk about, but just wanted to provide some context for you, again, in terms of what that dollar figure would look like.
Do you have any further breakdown on what the money going to tourism is doing this year? I know in the past, they've had specific requests for like video production or whatever it is they're working on.
I don't recall seeing a
Don't
formal
go there.
request, other than the letter we received, or the
Yeah,
email.
the email.
Which turned into the letter.
Right.
Did you see anything prior to me? I'm sorry, are we talking about the same thing? Are we talking about the chamber or?
No, the tourism commission, the one that has volunteers on it who,
That is a very small budget. That is
But for the-
$645.
no, the 6,800 and, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong
Oh, that's okay.
box. No, my fault.
Oh,
So that's where the 5,000 for the visitor center was.
Yes, that's why I was thinking that it was still there. That's why,
where the picture we'll call the cell phone tour. That was around 15.
I remember it. They've always had a thing that was going on.
The
That
actual was
was,
70, right now it's just down to 600.
okay, thank you. That's where I was confused.
So, go ahead, Mike.
I have a bigger question. When we did our budget last year, we had based our budget on the fact that the state was going to reimburse us for the property tax on the cars. We ended up never getting that money. Am I correct that our budget reflected never getting that money? So we had
It's a big budget.
not billed everybody, so in effect, we shortchanged the town, getting that 900, almost $1 million, when we really should have charged everybody for it.
Yeah, I think ultimately because of the Board of Finance considered that, they wanted to send out supplemental tax bills once the cap was raised. Their decision was based on the current year and the expenditure contingency. Felt like there was sufficient expenditure contingency that would be returning money to fund balance at the end of the year, so they didn't see the justification in sending out those bills. But you're right that on a budget-to-budget basis, then therefore feels like
That more than covers, or nearly covers our 1.7%. Am I correct? 900,000?
It's the bigger budget, it was.
No, it's a bigger budget.
yeah, it's the other.
Yeah.
But it's a chunk of that. And I almost feel like we're getting penalized by the state again, because now we're starting from a lower number, trying to cover our new expenses that are contractually bound, and we're trying to make up that difference.
Well,
It's still
I mean,
revenue.
I think it's
expense,
important to
though.
note at this point too, that
Okay.
technically, your budget as increased by the Board of Finance last year was increased by 2.5 million. So as we've been talking about 1.75, year over year, it's obviously not. In fact, right now, as it stands, you're at minus 7.6%.
Yes.
That's your actual budget change this year.
Right.
as we saw from Tri-Board on, they're considering the 2.5 million separate, but it was more appropriate than more separate. So, but I don't know if it's exactly what you're saying, but I think it is important to remember the distinction.
So we should get credit for that.
Well, I don't want to get penalized for it.
Right.
To Sean's point, I mean, within overall context, I think that is important, because the overall budget increase, when you looked at the manager's proposed, superintendent's proposed, factoring in that 2.5 million contingency, the overall budget increase was about a 0.37 or a 0.39. And why I do think that's relevant is that 2.5 million contingency. I mean, that we taxed people planning for that, so that was reflected in their tax bills, and that was reflected in the mill rate. So that was a real number. And so while I certainly understand, the philosophy that they were coming from about that 1.75% guidance, we did tax people on that 2.5 million contingency. So
tax
again, the
people for the
overall budget
2.5
was about a
million.
0.39.
No,
We didn't tax them.
no, the 2.5 million was a contingency.
No, there was two.
But it generated.
But it
No, I understand.
increased the
I
mill rate
understand.
and it generated
Yeah.
revenue.
There was
Right.
two contingencies.
Yeah.
There was the operating transfer contingency, which was a budgeted 2.5 million, and
Yes.
then there was an anticipated loss of revenue, which we did not tax people
Right,
for.
yeah.
We hedged our bets. We did it both ways.
Okay, you're right.
No, I think that's a totally valid point. Where that translates for me is how I feel about, a 3.926 versus a 1.75. Because the environment we're in will have a big influence in terms of how far I feel we need to push. So I do think it's appropriate for us to be pulling that out as we've done. But I do think for me, it influences what I ultimately recommend in terms of how much further we have to push. For me, Maria, kind of answering your question, are we at a point where we can give a little guidance? Does that make sense? Okay, or not? I mean, I don't want to.
Yeah, that's great. I'll come back and have a seat with you. So I can write a little easier.
So, I mean, just for me personally, I think you've created a really good budget. I'm very impressed with where we're at as well as the whole process. I just want to say kudos, to all of you, Eric, Sean, Melissa, everyone that was participating in this. When I first saw the 3.89, which now I'm proposing is a 3.926, I was a little worried about it, because it was, well beyond that 1.75. Pull out the contingency last year, it was, kind of well beyond the increases we've had. And so I was a little bit worried that it might not have been as conservative a budget as we needed to go to the Board of Finance with. But after reviewing it, I really don't feel that way. Here's the chunks that I see. There's a 1.696% increase, which is just contractual salaries and health insurance. There's a 0.165, which is utility increases. There's 1.1%, which is, the capital to operations, which to me is a philosophy that we're buying into with the Board of Finance. And then you've got 0.94 left, of which 0.39 of that is the ambulance. So in reality, take the ambulance out of that, we're really looking at a discretionary increase of roughly, 55 basis points. So you've conserved money where you can, we've maintained operations and services, and in a few select places, you've enhanced that, as well as, I think continuing to do something pretty significant for the Ambulance Association. So I'm very happy with this budget. I could support this budget as it is, from a conceptual point of view. From a process point of view, I do think, I've always believed that once we review your budget, we do need to do a good faith effort to look at, all right, what would have to happen to get to the in this case, 1.75. When I look at your list up there, I'm not proposing any reductions to contributions to outside agencies. I don't necessarily want to deviate from existing financial policies. So I'm really left at giving you directions at, you working with staff at what you think would be the best options in what are going to really be service reductions or elimination of services or programs, or other areas. And where I actually start comfortable with where we are right now, but I can't finalize my recommendation until we do that, so.
I agree. I would look for the same sort of direction. Again, I don't want to see service reductions, and I don't want to see elimination of services. I don't think anybody up here does, but I think we do have to go through the good faith effort of having that. The Board of Finance in the past has generally been more sympathetic to our contractual increases, because we are a smaller chunk of the budget. But that doesn't, I think, absolve us from doing our due diligence of being prepared, to go in there. And as I said last year, I would not advocate again for any diminution of the debt service funding. We have to go the other way.
Yeah.
It was a good idea for 1 year, but it was not a good idea for
Right.
1 year, because now we're sitting here using up that flexibility. And, as I've said, each capital item has its turn on the plan. And when those items get out of turn, they stack up, and then we have a significant issue where we get into it went from we should do it to we have to do it. And when two big items come up as have to do, that becomes a big problem for us.
Yeah.
That's hard to recover from. So, I mean, I agree. I always like to marinate on this for a couple of days too, give the public a chance to come in and yell at us at a Monday meeting, or advocate for that. And that's,
Strongly suggest.
and I
don't
hope
yell
they
at
do.
us.
And I said it at the last Board of Selectmen meeting, and it's, Joan, thank you for coming. But the rest of the community unfortunately does not show up, and I hope that people do on Monday or otherwise, or at least email us. Because they're certainly gonna email us after the referendum. So now's the time when people can affect change.
Yeah. Maria, is it realistic, this week to be able to give us some specifics on what would service reductions look like? Is that, I don't know what's possible, so I'm just asking. So if
For
we,
Thursday, yes. For
Yeah.
Monday.
No, totally fair.
Wouldn't
that
expect it.
Yeah.
Would be tight. I
I'm
think we could
not,
do some.
I'm not asking for anything crazy.
Yeah, I think we could do some for Monday, possibly,
I'm
but
just
Thursday
thinking-
would give us a little more time.
Sure.
Because again, some of the things that, again, would be examples of service reductions would be things like changing operating schedules for our facilities that are open to the public. It would just take us some time to sort of cost that out, building by building. So does that mean, for example, maybe town hall has, summer hours where for hourly staff, they're not here on Fridays. Does that mean that we don't have, Sunday hours at the library? Does that mean that we don't have Friday hours at the senior center? To cost out sort of scenarios across departments. Again, I think to do a lot of that for Monday night could be
Oh, for
challenging.
sure.
But
Yeah,
for
I'm not asking
Thursday,
for that.
certainly, I think we can provide some more extensive scenarios. And we'll also just need a bit of time to confer with the leadership team and ask for, within their respective service areas, some suggestions, particularly focusing more around the discretionary services.
I think even if we do come out with a higher budget than the 1.75, to be able to tell the story to the Board of Finance, that if we moved in this direction, this is what it would look like, and then they could make a fully informed decision.
So when we had the tri-board meeting, the Board of Finance seemed to be very happy to try to use what they viewed as excess fund balance to lower costs. Has there been any additional conversation? And the superintendent brought up potentially contribution to the medical plan, which I happen to agree with, because that can lower both the town and the educational side cost for a long period of time.
Yeah, we can definitely plan to come back with some of those options. I've had some conversations with Bob on that specific item. Costing out the actual dollar impact, some of it comes back to how comfortable you are within a certain, as you know, with the general service fund, within a certain margin of error, but we can certainly come back with some options there and see if there's combined.
But as, I guess my point is, as part of the package, again, from an expense side, but also from again, if they chose to, and again, it's their decision, not ours, but if they chose to move $1 million over to that fund, what does that do for the Board of Ed budget? What does that do for the Board of Selectmen budget? I'd imagine that makes some meaningful change to our medical contributions, not only this year, but in out years as well. Or OPEB, or, again, we're using reserves for reserves. We're not using reserves for operating. But there's different ways that we can use our reserves that can alleviate operating pressure and put us on a better fiscal footing. And my one last soapbox for the day is our employee benefits are $4.8 million. At some point, we seriously need to have the conversation about moving to DC plans.
what plan, Sean?
Defined contribution plan.
Contribution.
Now, not all that 4.8 is pension, but those pension costs continue to escalate year after year, and I know we've done a great job on the negotiation, but we need smooth and predictable numbers, and not subject to the environment that those defined benefit plans, which again, have disappeared everywhere else but in the public sector.
Well, and even in a lot of the public sector, they've disappeared.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And I know there's recruiting issues, I've heard all the stories. This town has been a leader in a number of places, and again, if I'm wrong, if we're wrong, I'm willing to take it on the chin, but I still think we should try.
Well, I think, and for what it's worth, because the DC plan is an option, we've made the DB plan, if it exists in the union contract, less attractive. We now have, as you saw for the first time last year, we're having to budget town share of the DC plan. Part of what we're seeing this year, fiscal 18, the DC town plan contribution is 25,000. So many new employees, and we've had a lot of turnover recently, electing the DC plan, that we now are approaching $55,000 for the coming year. So it actually had a $30,000 increase, but you're right. Unfortunately, there's a lag on the pension arc impact that we're gonna see in a few years. But I think to your point, Sean, some of that payoff we're gonna start to experience in the next 2 to 3 years. But I would say most new employees are electing the DC plan, which I think is good.
Excellent point.
Additionally, the movement from capital to operational, has that been discussed with the Board of Finance? Again, my historical memory is, I think we all agree on doing that, but, I mean, that is a 1.1% impact on our current budget, so I would want them giving us some participation in making that happen in a way that's meaningful. Have we talked to them about that, or?
I mean, yes, and I mean, I think that we're gonna be meeting on Tuesday night. I think it'll be certainly something that we can talk about. I know it's the night of the Board of Ed budget, but absolutely. I mean, I think philosophically, there's been different opinions of that in the past, but I think it's something that they're cognizant of for sure.
So the only other thing I would add, and I'm just being redundant, is, I mean, last year we were facing a lot of headwinds, and I think this year we've got some tailwinds financially. Revenue, the fact that the Board of Ed came in, at the 1.75, there's just more flexibility around the cap than would have existed in previous years. And, that increases my willingness to support a budget that's above that 1.75%. So at the end of the day, it all nets out to what's the impact on the mill rate, is really what I look at the end of the day. So.
Agreed.
That's why I feel there's flexibility here that might not exist in previous years.
Is there anything else that we would want to ask? Yeah, I'm sorry, Maria.
I think
go
what
ahead.
probably would be helpful is for us just to wrap up the day with the spreadsheet that shows potential additions or subtractions. Can we pull that up, Sean? He's been doing a great job of keeping track through your conversation of the list.
good.
So I think that just might be a nice recap before we.
Yeah,
pull up
let's
the
do
list.
that.
Okay.
That's exactly what I was thinking, where's our list?
And that way too, if we've forgotten something, just let us know and we'll flag that.
I think it always shows how many.
Right.
Yeah. Numbers for the Board of Finance.
1.75, give me a break.
I know. Well, but they should recognize the move from
Afraid to stand up,
operating.
because it won't be for long.
They should even credit that as
They should credit it. I
1.75,
know.
yeah.
That's what I mean, they should credit that.
Yeah.
And to Maria's credit, we aren't going in, including the contingency last year, right?
Exactly.
Technically speaking, we could go in and say
We didn't
our
do-
bu- our bu-
we're not
we
increasing
could go
at
in
all.
with, it's a
Yeah.
decrease.
It's a decrease.
Well, we can see, kind of take these piece by piece. So, similar to last year, I've just been sort of tracking some of the comments you've made. These are not exhaustive necessarily, but please point out if there's any that are missing. But what we have, so, to start the meeting, we have the youth services budget shift of $8,000. And then the corresponding $1,000 correction for the public agency support and social services, where that came from, and the new line is created. The police, again, net 1,400 in for the education stipend, and 1,400 out of the uniform allowance. Just those were again combined last year, so it was just an issue of how we parse them out. There was some talk about whether to add an additional social services employee. At an MSW level, this is the number that Maria gave me as possibility there. I know we didn't get into great detail about that, but just in terms of a possible add. Another option there is, Kristen had given us some numbers on her own additional licensure funding, 5825, and then the Chamber of Commerce 5,000. These are just some, as we've been just sort of brainstorming some topics that came up, and again, we can take them out, add more. Over on the possible reduction side, outside of those first two we talked about, the probate court updated budget request, that one you should do either way, because that's the new request number. There's some talk about the dial-a-ride possible cut. This would again be, if you wanted to cut your expenditure budgets to reflect the lack of revenue, but otherwise that 1581 is really a revenue impact, general fund revenue. So it's relatively small considering the rest of the revenue items we have. And then I added on here just that technically the delta for the Chamber of Commerce over what they had asked for last year is the 5,000, but possibly less than 825 if you want to just do either or. So those are the items I have here. Down below, I have just some notes because they're not direct general funds, these are over the capital side. The irrigation capital item reducing from 100,000 down to 40,000, and then shifting it into CNR. And then a possible add of, I heard a range of 3 to 4 million for this police radio upgrade. So I just put 3,500. This is just kind of more my own notes. It's not really summing to anything in the capital plan.
We should take out the 2.5 million from last year, so makes us a better number.
Oh, the 2.5. Yeah, that is true. I mean, again, it's been a very unusual year to track. But like
Have a
you
little
said,
line that
yes.
says removal of contingency from last year.
well, it's up here at the top, right? So we have fiscal 18's budget is technically what we adopted is 22,604,910.
Yeah.
When you remove the 2.5 million
Exactly.
contingency, that's our starting
That's
point.
a fair number.
Hmm.
So-
Right.
I think you present that first, and then you say, but we pulled that
Sure.
out, this is what we got.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right, and again, I think one of the other challenges we had when crafting the budget was about half of that $400,000 that you would be looking for, again, was reserve money that was used for ongoing operating expenses. So it was a little under 200,000, so that was just, again, a pretty big hole that we had to
Yeah.
overcome.
Yep.
I can sum up some next steps, if that works, and then we can, it's been a long day, appreciate it. So our meeting on Monday, where we'll continue the conversation, we have a potential meeting, it's Thursday night, the 16th, right? And,
15th.
was the 15th?
Thursday's the 15th.
Okay, then it's the 15th, thank you. I echo Sean's comments, please reach out to us, email, phone, public comment. This is, we represent you, so please let us know your thoughts. I really appreciate the staff time to put this together. I'm always blown away when I hear from town staff about the work that's going on, the professionalism, the enthusiasm for the work, and I really, really mean it. I think one of the best things about sitting in this chair is I get to see things that 99% of taxpayers don't get to see, and it's really, really good. And I thank my board members for the collaboration today. I think this was a really good day.
Agreed.
With that, I
So moved.
wish you all a good night.
Move that we adjourn.
Okay.
Yeah.